Chapter 26. Contained. "Wait here," Wintour ordered with a curt and annoyed voice as he and Nick entered their warehouse. The two guards waited in front of the building like two children who had just been yelled at, which wasn't inaccurate. Naturally, after they had realized that they had just shoved one of the heirs of the Melfion family to the ground, they had immediately apologized profusely. Wintour had just acted very calmly but coldly and told them that they were going to be following them for a bit. The two guards didn't protest. As the door of the warehouse closed in front of them, the anxiety of the two guards exploded. If Wintour decided to get his family's lawyers involved, they could very well lose their jobs, if not worse. Meanwhile, Nick and Wintour walked over to the only containment unit they owned. Nick waited in front of the entrance while Wintour operated a console with many buttons to the side of the containment unit. A moment later, a loud alarm came from the containment unit, as red lights lit up everywhere. The two of them weren't surprised. This was the alarm of a containment unit being fully opened. The cheapest containment units only had 3 ways to open them. First, opening a tiny door to put handheld objects into it. Second, opening a door for a human to get through. Third, opening the big gate to put a specter in. But wait, the Dreamer was quite small. Why couldn't Nick just carry it through the normal door? Well, a containment unit was more than just a big cube of steel. There were also several sensors, alarms, barriers, and defenses on it. When a human passed through the door, the containment unit wouldn't care, but if a specter tried to pass through it, all the defenses would activate. Otherwise, small and sneaky specters would be able to sneak out of the containment unit when people walked in and out of it. So, when a specter was put into a containment unit, one had to open the main gate, which also deactivated all of the defenses. Naturally, more expensive containment units had more ways to open them, but this was just the cheapest variant. After the big gate fully opened, Nick walked into the containment unit. The gate slowly closed behind him again. When it was fully closed, the artificial light appeared in the containment unit. Normal artificial light didn't help against the nightmare's influence, but containment units could use Zephix to illuminate the inside. More expensive containment units had special tunnels made of reflective glass, which would safely deliver sunlight into the containment unit, cutting down on the cost of lighting. Sadly, their shitty containment unit didn't have such luxury. They had to make do with using Zephix to light the inside. Luckily, they only needed to light the inside when a human was in there, since specters didn't need light. When the light turned on, Nick dumped the Dreamer into the middle of the containment unit. Due to the Zephix blocker, the Dreamer didn't move. Nick looked at the motionless Dreamer for a couple of seconds until the normal door of the containment unit opened behind him. Nick bent forward and grabbed the Zephix blocker. After untangling it, Nick ran out of the containment unit, and Wintour immediately closed the door. Silence. They had done it. The Dreamer was inside of the containment unit. Wintour looked at the console beside the containment unit and checked its operating status. A couple of minutes later, Wintour nodded with a sigh of relief. Everything is operating normally. The Dreamer has been detected, and the defenses are ready to engage if it tries anything, Wintour said. We don't have to worry about it escaping. Nick nodded while releasing a sigh of relief. Finally, they had the Dreamer securely contained. Now, Wintour said as his voice turned darker while turning to the exit of the warehouse. Let's deal with those two. What do you have in mind? Nick asked. An exchange, Wintour said. The guards are afraid of my background, and they are going to do anything to get my lawyers off their backs. Come, Wintour said as he walked to the exit. Nick just followed him. The two of them found the two guards quickly, and Wintour told them to follow him. The guards just followed Wintour while trying to apologize some more. Eventually, the 4 of them reached a tall building with the symbol of a green carriage on it. This was one of the biggest hospital chains in the world, and they operated in many cities. The company owning these hospitals was a Zephix manufacturer primarily, but they had one of the few contained level 6 specters. The contained specter was a carriage that was called the Merchant. When one threw corpses into the carriage, healing potions came out of the carriage, and a bit of Zephix would be given off by the carriage. Naturally, the company made use of the healing medicine and created hospitals everywhere. For profit, of course. One recovery bath, and I will forget what happened. After all, I need one, Wintour said as he shook his dislocated wrist a bit. The two guards took deep breaths and looked at each other in horror. Sir Melfian, I'm not sure. It's either you or your district that will pay for my treatment, Wintour said, interrupting the guard. Which one is it? The two guards retreated a bit and talked with each other in whispers. They seemed to argue intensely. It took nearly 3 minutes for them to return. We'll pay, one of them said with a sigh. Wintour nodded, and the four of them walked into the hospital. When they walked to the receptionist tried her best to remain somewhat professional under the immense stench that assaulted her. If she hadn't seen the two guards behind the two dirty visitors, she would have already called security to throw them out. Yes. How can I help you? She asked with a forced smile. 1 full-body recovery bath and 1 cleansing bath. The 2 baths are paid separately, Wintour said. Of course, the receptionist said, her professionalism now genuine. After all, these were actual customers, apparently. That is 150 credits for the cleansing bath, she said. The next moment, Wintour took out a couple of notes and put them on the table. The receptionist collected them with a polite smile and gave Wintour a small orange token. And that will be 4,800 credits for the full-body recovery bath, she said. Wintour gestured to the guards. One of the guards walked over and handed the receptionist a card. The receptionist thanked him and put the card onto a plate of steel. Then, she grabbed a small piece of something that looked like clay and wrote the number 4,800 on it. The next moment, she put a small signature below the number, and she handed the piece of clay to the guard. The guard released a shaky breath and signed it. Thank you, the receptionist said as she put the card on top of the piece of clay and put everything into a metal box. A green light came out of the box. A moment later, the receptionist took the card out and handed it to the guard. At the same time, she took out the piece of clay, which had now been hardened, and put it under her table. Sadly, there was no easy way to communicate with the bank directly. Every week, the business would deliver the small pieces of clay to the banks and get the money. The receptionist handed Wintour a green ticket with several complicated black lines. Wintour looked at the two guards. We're done. You can leave. Thank you, sir, one of the guards said. Then, the two guards left the hospital. The next moment, Wintour held out his ticket for the full-body recovery path to Nick. Have fun. Chapter 27. A Bath. Nick looked with surprise at Wintour. He had thought that Wintour would maybe give his ticket to him, but when it actually happened, Nick was still surprised. Nick felt bad accepting something so expensive. You just earned us a ton of money, Wintour said, not looking at Nick. Just take it. Nick hesitated, but in the end, he just accepted it. After all, he also didn't really want to die from his injuries, and despite his current demeanor, he was in quite a lot of pain. When Nick took the ticket, Wintour nodded. Just follow the signs. I'll wait for you in 3 hours. That's usually how long these baths take. I've had my fair share of them in the past. He had his fair share of them? Nick thought. Nick doubted that Wintour had taken a 3-hour bath for every minor injury he had ever received, which meant that Wintour had probably been heavily injured multiple times before. Sure, thank you, Wintour, Nick said. The next moment, a smile appeared on Wintour's face. Have fun, he said again, as he walked through one of the doors. Nick looked at the ticket in his hand with anxiety. 4,800 credits. He held 4,800 credits in his hand right now. The most money Nick had ever held in his hands had been 500 after he had finished a quite unsavory job. 4,800 credits was a lot. Eventually, Nick looked around and found some signs hanging from the ceiling. Nick's reading comprehension was still weak, but with enough time, he could understand what he was reading. After wandering around for about 3 minutes, Nick finally found the entrance to the full-body recovery baths. Nick slowly opened the door and looked into the room. It had a couple of lockers and racks for clothing. Come in, a woman shouted with a friendly tone. Nick awkwardly walked into the room. He had never been in such a place before. When the woman in the room noticed Nick's appearance, a pained and apprehensive smile appeared on her face. Nick just showed her his ticket. Right this way, sir, she said with a forced smile as she gestured to one of the doors. Do you prefer to undertake the cleansing bath with or without clothing? Cleansing bath? Nick asked. I thought this is a full-body recovery bath. The woman just smiled awkwardly. Sir, it is customary to take a cleansing bath before undertaking a recovery bath. We need you to be clean for the recovery bath to work properly. Oh, Nick said. I'd like to keep my clothing on then. Of course, sir, the woman said as she opened one of the doors to the side. Please, step inside. Nick felt out of place, but he followed the woman's instructions. The room Nick entered was quite small, and he could see 5 light blue baths. Please, the woman said as she gestured towards one of the baths. Nick awkwardly stepped forward and slowly lowered his body into the bath. The blue liquid, which didn't feel like water, got pushed out of the bath but was quickly drained. SSSSSS. The next moment, the water around Nick started to bubble and released sounds akin to boiling water. It was quite loud. At the side, the woman's eyes opened widely in shock. Wow, she involuntarily commented. Oh? Nick uttered. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just surprised, the woman said. I've never heard the cleansing bath become this loud before. This isn't normal, Nick asked. No, it isn't, the woman said. The cleansing bath is filled with a liquid that gets used up when it comes into contact with dangerous impurities. The more impurities it comes into contact with, the more liquid gets used up, and when the liquid gets used up, it makes this hissing noise. But it's never been this loud before. If I may ask, what happened? She asked. I fell into the sewers, Nick said. Fell into? The woman said before she trailed off. She couldn't imagine falling into the sewers. How would that even happen? She had never even seen the sewers in her life. Naturally, since the normal outer city didn't have rusty metal grates as their flooring, the woman had never seen or smelled the sewers. Because of that, she also had no idea just how dirty the sewers were. However, when she saw Nick relaxing, she decided to stop asking questions. Right now, except for his heavy injuries, Nick felt great. Your body has been cleansed, the woman said. Do you prefer a quick cleansing shower for your head, or are you fine with taking a quick dive in the bath? I'll take a quick dive, Nick said. The woman nodded. About a minute in total should be enough. You can take multiple dives, of course. Nick nodded back, took a breath, and went underwater. For the first time, he was actually happy to be submerged in liquid. Nick couldn't describe just how great this felt. After a minute, Nick surfaced again. Please, step out, the woman said. Nick did just that, and when he could finally take a good look at his appearance, his eyes widened. He had never been so clean before in his entire life. All the stains in his clothing were gone, and his skin felt so smooth. However, not everything was great. Nick saw that his skin had started to swell in multiple places. Apparently, his wounds were already starting to get infected and swollen. A moment later, Nick heard a shocked gasp, and he turned to the woman. I'm sorry, she said with genuine worry and pity. I'm so sorry. Nick wasn't sure what she meant. Since Nick was now clean, the woman could actually see Nick's injuries properly. Broken bones, destroyed nails, and bleeding cuts all across his body. It was like Nick had fallen down a staircase made of swords. Please, follow me, she said with a slightly urgent voice as she opened the next door. Nick did just that. In the next room, he saw 15 green baths, but compared to the previous baths, there were also several pieces of external equipment. For example, there were breathing masks beside a couple of the baths. Nick also saw that people were in 4 of the baths. Please, in here, the woman said as she gestured to one of the baths. Nick walked over and slowly entered the bath. As soon as he was fully submerged, he started to feel warm. The next moment, a breathing mask was put on his face, and a hand gently pushed him into the bath. It took some getting used to, but eventually Nick managed to acclimate to staying below the surface. The feeling the bath gave him was so great and warm that Nick felt himself drift away, and just a couple of minutes later, Nick fell asleep. Chapter 28, Uniform. Eventually, Nick woke up. While everything had felt great, it was not so great that he would finish a whole night's sleep in the bath. Nick wanted to scratch his nose but accidentally hit the breathing mask. After that, he remembered where he was. and he quickly sat up in the bath. The bath was filled with a liquid denser than water, which was why Nick didn't swim in it. When Nick poked his head out, he saw one other person in the baths, but he didn't remember that one. The others probably already left. The next moment, Nick's eyes met with one of the employees, and the employee walked over. It was a woman in a green uniform, but a different one from before. After a bit, the employee reached Nick's bath. "Please, take off the mask." Nick did just that, and the woman looked at Nick's face. A moment later, she wrote something down on a clipboard. "Do you feel pain anywhere?" she asked, neutrally. Nick moved his shoulders and legs around a bit. "No, everything feels great," Nick said with surprise. "And your nose?" the woman asked. Nick's eyes widened, and he quickly touched his nose. When he noticed that his nose was also fully healed, he was quite surprised. "It's healed?" he asked in confusion. The employee nodded. "The healing liquid doesn't need to be in direct contact with the injured area. It also seeps through your skin and travels across your body." She wrote a bit more on the clipboard before turning the clipboard around and holding it to Nick. "Sign here, and you can go." Nick slowly and carefully stood up. Surprisingly, the liquid was falling off him without leaving any stains or making him wet. The next moment, Nick took the clipboard into his hand and started to read. "Are there any problems?" the employee asked, with a slightly impatient tone after over 2 minutes. "Oh no," Nick answered quickly. "I'm just not very good at reading." The employee just rolled her eyes. "It basically just says that you feel healthy and that you want to leave." Nick nodded. "Okay, but I still want to read it." The employee got even more annoyed, but she didn't say anything. After around 3 more minutes, Nick was finally done. Luckily, there wasn't a lot written on the clipboard, and it wasn't nearly as hard to understand as the NDA Nick signed. Eventually, Nick grabbed the pen on the clipboard and awkwardly signed. He still wasn't used to writing. Nick handed the clipboard back, and the employee quickly grabbed it. "Have a nice day. You can go," she said curtly before walking away. Nick just nodded and walked to the exit. Luckily, there was a second door, which meant that he didn't need to pass through the room with the cleansing baths again. Since Nick hadn't put any of his belongings away, he could directly leave. While Nick was walking through the hospital, he looked around with interest. His life was no longer in danger, which allowed him to appreciate the look of the hospital. Everything seemed so clean. Nick had never seen anything this clean before. It felt so alien to him. Nick had lived in the dregs for his entire life, and the dregs were not the cleanest place. When Nick reached the lobby, he only saw 2 people, the receptionist and a boy. The boy was standing at the side of the lobby with a stack of clothes in his hands, and he awkwardly looked around. The boy was maybe 14 years old or something like that. For a second, the eyes of Nick and the boy met. The boy looked at Nick with anxiety and looked at his clothing. Then, he looked towards the direction of the baths again. "You searching for someone?" Nick asked. The boy was surprised when Nick started a conversation. Yes, the boy answered nervously. "I'm supposed to deliver these clothes to someone called Nick." Nick blinked twice. "That's me." "Oh?" the boy uttered as he looked at Nick with surprise. But then, his brows furrowed as he looked at Nick's clothing again. "But your clothing isn't dirty," he said. "I bathed in my clothing," Nick said. "I presume these clothes are from Wintour?" When the boy heard Nick say Wintour's name, he sighed in relief. "Yes," he said. The next moment, he held the clothes forward, and Nick took them. Nick couldn't see all of the clothes since they were folded, but he could see quite a bit of red and black. That was when Nick's eyes widened, and he subconsciously gripped the clothes tighter. "Is that Crimson Fungus City's official Zephyx extractor uniform?" Nick asked in surprise. The boy nodded with a smile. "Yes, sir." At this moment, it really hit Nick. He was a Zephyx extractor. Nick had seen a couple of extractors walking around, and they had worn a uniform just like this one. Crimson Fungus City required all Zephyx extractors to wear this uniform, no matter to which company they belonged. Extractors had to wear the uniform when they were on duty, but they were also encouraged to wear it in their spare time. While it wasn't mandatory for extractors to wear their uniforms in their free time, It had become the norm after many lawsuits. What if an extractor uses their ability? Would they be on duty or not? What if someone tried to steal from them and got incinerated by the extractor's ability? Of course, the city didn't care about the fate of criminals, but they very much cared about the criminals' bodies and blood. Even criminals brought in blood and money. Zephyx extractors are allowed to kill people from the dregs with a good reason. Otherwise, they would need to pay a fine of about 5,000 credits. Extractors are also allowed to kill people of the outer city, but only when the person tried to physically assault them first. Because of the many unnecessary deaths, the city encouraged the extractors to wear their uniform when going out, even in their spare time. And now, I finally have my very own uniform, Nick thought as he looked at the uniform in his hand. I'm now officially a Zephyx extractor. Chapter 29, Acquaintance. Thanks, Nick said as he looked at the boy again. No problem, the boy said with a polite smile. I will be working under you for the foreseeable future, sir. Nick blinked a couple of times in surprise. You're working for me? The boy nodded. Yes, I'm a steward apprentice in Sir Wintour's family, sir. I'm going to be working for the two of you for the next couple of months to gain experience. If there is anything you need, just tell me. Please also tell me if there is anything I can improve. Nick felt a bit strange being superior to someone else. He hadn't led anyone before. Sure, what's your name? Nick asked. Oh, excuse me, the boy shouted nervously. I forgot to introduce myself. My name's Petor Taylor, sir. Please refer to me as Petor. Nick nodded. All right, Petor. You can call me Nick. Petor looked quite surprised, calling the chief Zephyx extractor of a Zephyx manufacturer by their first name. Okay, sure, thank you, Petor said, not daring to call Nick by his name. Nick nodded with a smile and walked out of the hospital, Petor following him. Where's Wintour? Nick asked as they walked towards the warehouse. Sir is currently in the family's estate. He told me that you do not need to work for a couple of days, Petor explained. Nick furrowed his brows. Why? He asked. I don't know, sir, Petor said. If I am not told the reason, it means it is not of my concern. However, Sir has also said that someone will be telling you all the necessary things in the headquarters. Someone's going to tell me these things? Nick thought with a raised eyebrow. After walking for a bit, Nick arrived in front of the warehouse. Whenever Nick saw the warehouse, he had to take a short moment to look at it. It wasn't anything big or majestic, but it represented his future. Nick just loved looking at it. Eventually, Nick walked into the warehouse with Petor in tow. As soon as Nick entered the warehouse, he immediately became wary. At this moment, a cloaked figure was closely inspecting the console beside the containment unit of the Dreamer. However, since Wintour said that someone was waiting for Nick, he didn't immediately attack. Please, wait outside, Petor, the cloaked person said without turning around. When he heard the voice, Petor realized who it was, and he quickly nodded. Of course, sir. The next moment, Petor walked out of the warehouse. Meanwhile, Nick looked at the cloaked person with furrowed brows. The voice was familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. The cloaked person turned to Nick. How's reading practice going? The person asked. And then, Nick suddenly remembered where he had heard that voice from. Albert, Nick asked in surprise. The cloaked person, Albert, chuckled and removed the cloak, revealing his gray and black hair. When Nick saw Albert's face, he smiled brightly. What are you doing here? Nick asked as he walked closer. Wintour told me what happened, Albert said. He thought you might need a bit of guidance since this is your first Spectre. When Nick heard that, he released a sigh of relief. Naturally, Nick had been quite nervous about the Dreamer. How was he supposed to get Zephyx out of the Dreamer? Nick had no idea. Luckily, Albert was now here, making things much easier. Yes, I think I could use some help, Nick said. Albert chuckled a bit and turned to the console. Everything looks fine, he said. Prefix levels are elevated, but that's to be expected since it is currently recovering. Zephyx levels are at 0, but that's also expected. The Dreamer is not a Spectre that passively gives off Zephyx. I already took a look at it earlier, and I have to say, you really went to town on this one, Albert said with a chuckle. The poor thing is so beat up that it doesn't even want to move right now. It didn't even move when I poked it. Nick looked with a worried look at Albert. It's not dying, right? Oh, nah, you don't need to worry about that. It's quite hard to kill a specter. To kill it, you would need to destroy the core in its head or shred its torso to pieces. Injuries that would kill humans just put specters in a sort of stasis or hibernation, and as long as they are not isolated from prefix, they will recover quite rapidly, Albert explained. Nick nodded in relief. He didn't know what he would have done if the dreamer died after all that had happened. Everything looks good, Albert said once more as he lightly slapped the console. Then, he turned to Nick. "Wanna go get Zephix out of it right now?" Nick raised an eyebrow. Wintour said that the dreamer is too injured to be worked with, and that it will take a couple of days. Albert's smile widened. He's right. Then, Albert took a small bottle out of one of his pockets and waved it around a bit. "But he doesn't know I have this." "What's that?" Nick asked as he looked at the bottle with interest. "The stuff you've been bathing in," Albert said. "Just a lot stronger." Nick remembered the green bath as he looked at the green liquid. "Wait, you're using that on the dreamer?" Nick asked. "Why not?" Albert asked with a grin. "Well, what if something happens?" Nick asked. Albert just snorted. "What's supposed to happen, Nick? I'm a level 4 extractor. I can kill the dreamer with a casual kick." Nick scratched the back of his head. Sure, Albert was powerful, but Nick still felt that it was a bit weird to heal a specter with expensive medicine. "I mean, sure, if you want to," Nick said with a shrug. Albert's smile widened, and he mischievously moved his eyebrows up and down. Then, Albert pressed a button on the console, and a moment later, the personnel door to the containment unit opened. Albert walked in without hesitation, and Nick followed him nervously. Chapter 30. Negotiation. The lights in the containment unit had already been turned on. Every second the lights were on was expensive, but it was a necessary expenditure. After all, they couldn't work with the specter in the dark. When Nick entered the containment unit, he saw a black shadow in the corner of the room. The dreamer was lying in the most distant corner, unmoving. "All right, Princess," Albert said loudly as he walked towards the dreamer. "Enough moping around." The dreamer didn't move. Albert opened the small bottle and very carefully removed one drop of liquid with his finger. Then, he just wiped his finger on the dreamer's head and moved back a bit. A moment later, the dreamer's body twitched, and then its body began to smoke. Nick saw how the dreamer's eyes were regrowing at a visible speed. On top of that, its broken wings and ribs were moving back into place with cracking sounds. Around a minute later, the dreamer had fully recovered. Even though Nick knew that he was safe behind Albert, he still felt a bit nervous. After all, this was a specter. The dreamer slowly opened its eyes and looked around the containment unit. Then, its eyes fell on Nick. Ding! 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 Suddenly, a loud alarm sounded in the room. Nick knew what this alarm meant. The alarm sounded when a sharp spike in prefix levels inside the containment unit was measured. A sudden spike in prefix levels meant that the specter was preparing an attack. Apparently, the dreamer wasn't the biggest fan of Nick. An instant later, the dreamer shot to its feet and charged at Nick. "Hole up, Missy." Bang! Albert's left hand opened and grabbed the dreamer's head in a fluid motion. The dreamer flapped around and used its talons to stab Albert's torso. Ding! Yet when the dreamer's talons hit Albert's torso, a metallic sound reverberated throughout the room, and Albert wasn't injured in the slightest. Ding! 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 The dreamer used several more attacks. But no matter what it did, Albert wasn't injured in the slightest. Albert didn't even move. After about 30 seconds, the dreamer gave up. Obviously, this man right in front of it was far more powerful than it was. "There we go," Albert said, as he put the dreamer down again. "Now, can we have a normal conversation?" The dreamer just glared at the distant Nick. It really didn't like Nick. "Just ignore him for now," Albert said, moving to stand between the dreamer and Nick. The next moment, Albert squatted to be at eye level with the dreamer. Surprisingly, the dreamer also looked into Albert's eyes. There was no fear in its eyes. "You're a specter that feeds on mentality," Albert said. "You're not a specter that feeds off blood, organs, bodies, death, or unfortunate circumstances. You feed on mentality. which means that you have gone through enough memories to understand what I am saying. I'm quite sure of it. The dreamer didn't show any reaction. I'm not sure if you realize your current circumstances, so let me enlighten you. You have been captured, and you are inside a containment unit from a Zephix manufacturer. The dreamer showed no reaction. You are not going to break out. That's not going to happen. This is your new home indefinitely. However, if you manage to gain the trust of the company, we might be able to enter a cooperation in the future. At that point, you can leave the containment unit. But until then, you are stuck here. And I'm also quite sure that you know why we humans catch specters, right? The dreamer showed no reaction. We want Zephix, the stuff you produce when you absorb all that energy from the atmosphere, Albert explained. As long as you give us Zephix, your life won't be bad. We will even help you in becoming stronger. The stronger you become, the more prefix and Zephix you contain, which leaves less prefix and Zephix for all the specters that are still roaming free. Increasing your power is also in our interest. Because of that, we will not be stealing all of your Zephix, only the majority. The precise amount is not up to me, but that's how it usually works. We give you food, you give us Zephix, you become stronger, we get money. Understand? The dreamer showed no reaction. It just kept on looking forward. All right, Albert said as he stood up again. Let me give you a couple of hours to think. Now my little friend over here will be doing most of the work, so I don't want you to attack him. The dreamer moved slightly to the side so that it could look at Nick again. Nick just looked back emotionlessly. The next moment, Albert took out a little gadget from one of his pockets and looked at it. Man, it really doesn't like you, Albert said to Nick with a chuckle. Specters aren't usually that angry when they get captured, you know. The gadget Albert had in his hand was a mobile prefix scanner. It had the same function as the alarm from earlier, but it was portable and had a higher sensitivity. Just now, the prefix levels had been going up and down, almost like the dreamer debated attacking Nick again. Now listen here. One more thing, Albert said, pushing the dreamer's head to look at him again. If you don't cooperate, we'll have to do the bargain bin method, and you don't want that. Nick raised an eyebrow. Bargain bin method? The dreamer looked at Albert again. Most specters cooperate to some degree. Not all of them cooperate fully, but they at least consume stuff to continue growing, which produces Zephix. But there are also the specters that completely refuse to do anything. They believe that they can simply use up our money by forcing us to spend resources on keeping them contained without gaining anything from them. These specters are not very popular with the manufacturers, but there is still a way to get money out of them. The next moment, Albert grabbed the tip of the dreamer's right wing, Ripe, and tore it off. The dreamer pulled its wing back, but it didn't seem like it was in pain. Albert showed the dreamer the part of the wing he had torn off. Then, Albert took out a small box with a shredder on top. Albert put the part of the dreamer he had torn off onto the shredder, and the shredder immediately turned the part into tiny particles. After that, the wires all over the box started to electrify, and a minute later, the particles in the box vanished. Albert opened the box and showed it to the dreamer. You get it? Albert asked. The dreamer looked into the box. Just now, it had felt a bit of Zephix coming out of the box. That's the bargain bin method, Albert said. We can tear about 70% of your body off without killing you. We shove that body into the mixer, get our Zephix, and give you a week to recover. Albert slowly stood up. Either you cooperate, or that's your future. It's your decision. We'll be back in about 3 hours. After that, Albert walked out of the containment unit. The dreamer just looked at Nick. Nick looked back, but he also left a couple of seconds later. The dreamer just kept looking at the door. Chapter 31, Old Lady. After Albert and Nick left the containment unit, Nick just looked at Albert with a raised eyebrow. So, you just talked to them? Albert just laughed. At least that's the first thing we try generally. It doesn't take a lot of resources, and it's rather quick. Might as well try this before we invest lives and energy. Does it actually work? Nick asked. Sometimes. Not always, though, Albert said. The thing is, the dreamer is a specter that feeds on mentality, which means it actually understands humans to a certain degree. It might not be able to articulate itself or learn how to speak, but it should be able to understand most of what we say. Working with a specter that feeds on mentality can be a blessing and a curse at the same time. It's a blessing since you can almost always communicate directly with them, making most things very smooth. But it can also be a curse since specters that feed on mentality are generally much more intelligent than other kinds of specters. Specters like these breach almost as much as force specters. Like there is this one specter called the Old Lady. She is constantly in agony and pain, but she is still extremely friendly. Extractors can extract Zephix simply by talking with her. I worked with her a couple of times. She's actually very easy to work with, and it is even fun at times. She is a great conversationalist, and she always shows real care towards my problems, at least when she's not wincing in pain or complaining about the darkness or her loneliness. Nick looked sympathetic when he heard Albert's description, but the next moment, Albert suddenly pointed at Nick's face. That's what she's after. Pity. The old lady feeds on pity. On pity? Nick asked. Albert nodded. Yep. She grows more powerful by eliciting pity from people. By being nice to them and making them like you, they are far more likely to feel bad for your circumstances. That's why it's such a great time to talk to her. In like the first year of her being in the containment unit, she breached 3 times. Just for your info, that's a lot, Albert said. The first one was when one of the clerks got to know her and decided to free her. Of course, a rational human being wouldn't do something like that since they would essentially forfeit their life, but specters that feed on mentality have many subtle mental influences that can cloud your judgment. Naturally, when the old lady came out, she immediately killed the clerk to make sure that she didn't call anyone. After that, she tried to get out of the building, but she ran across an off-duty extractor, who rapidly suppressed her and put her back in the containment unit. The second time was after she had worked and talked with the same extractor for around a month. Back then, we saw no issues, but it turned out that the more you talked to her, the closer your attachment to her. So, after working with her for over a month, the extractor essentially became her eternal servant, but never showed any signs on the outside. Naturally, the extractor busted her out, and the 2 of them ran away. 5 people died on their escape. It took several days to catch them, and funnily enough, a different manufacturer captured them, which meant that the old lady now belonged to a completely different company. The next moment, Albert laughed loudly, and then she broke out again within a week by getting a clerk to free her again, and the first manufacturer recaptured her. She hasn't broken out since then. They constantly rotate clerks and extractors, making sure that everyone only gets to talk to her once a week. Nick blinked a couple of times in surprise. He had expected that, as soon as the specters were in the containment units, they would remain there. But now, he had heard of a specter that had breached 3 times in a year via multiple ways. So yeah, Albert said, looking at Nick. They are easy to work with, but if you are careless even once, they will breach and cause you massive trouble. Nick could only nod. And the dreamer is one of those, Nick commented. Yep, Albert said. I'm pretty certain that the dreamer will agree to work with us, but if you are careless in any way, it will not hesitate to kill anyone to get out. Nick, I'm going to tell you something that my old mentor has told me. Back then, I didn't believe him, but after decades of working with specters, I can tell you that he spoke the truth. Albert put his hands on Nick's shoulders and looked him deep in the eyes. Specters cannot feel happiness, companionship, or pity, Albert said solemnly. After decades of research performed by thousands of extractors, we have found not even a single specter that can feel any of these things. Whenever you see them being in pain or being supportive, it is only an act. They want to get closer to you in some way for some sort of gain. Never believe them. Never become their friend. Never try to ally with them, unless you know that working for you is more beneficial for the specter than being free. Specters will always do what is most beneficial to them. And even then, there are specters that act chaotically against their own interests. Every specter is unique, and every specter needs to be treated differently. Even the blood mosquito is contained inside a special containment unit. It has worked together with Crimson Fungus City for decades, but they still don't dare to let its main body out of their sight. Kugelblitz always has at least 2 level 4 extractors or a level 5 extractor stationed near the blood mosquito, even though there has been no issue with it for decades. That's how careful you have to be of them. Do you understand? Albert asked with a serious tone. Nick took a deep breath. Then, he nodded with conviction. I will never feel empathy for a specter. Chapter 32 Stages. Good, Albert said with a sigh. Anyway, how about I tell you about some general things regarding working with other specters? Sounds good, Nick said. The next moment, Nick and Albert walked over to the side of the warehouse and sat in some chairs. For the next 3 hours, Albert taught Nick about general techniques for working with different specters. The more Nick heard, the gloomier he felt. Apparently, there were quite a great number of specters that simply gained power by killing people, and they only produced Zephyx that way. These kinds of specters were either amazing or almost worthless. It all depended on the moral flexibility of the manufacturer and their standing in the community. As the de facto owner of the city, Kugelblitz didn't use any unsavory methods like this, but there were a couple of manufacturers that did just that. Naturally, Kugelblitz acted like the righteous authority and tried to uncover the obvious practices of the manufacturers, but behind closed curtains, they were most likely paid off to look the other way. These other manufacturers mostly got their Zephyx from dying people. An old person has a horrible disease that will eventually lead to their death. Hey, want to earn a ton of money for the family you're leaving behind? You just gotta die a bit earlier. And apparently there were always enough sick people, even though Albert said that the hygiene and cleanliness in the inner city was brutally high. Albert even went as far as to say that getting sick in the inner city without outside influence was nearly impossible. Albert didn't directly say it, but he suspected that the manufacturers were using shady methods to spread these diseases, but none of that had been proven yet. Naturally, Nick was not really worried about all of that, but about what he would do if he captured such a specter. Killing someone just for a bit of money, that felt unacceptable to him. Sadly, the only other option to get Zephyx out of these kinds of specters was to use the bargain bin method, and when Albert mentioned the bargain bin method again, he actually chuckled in embarrassment. Under Nick's stunned gaze, Albert told him that Wintour actually didn't own a shredder like the one Albert had shown him. Apparently, the cheapest method to shred parts of specters was buying a huge shredder that cost Zephyx to operate. Its prize was 2 million credits, over 4 times as much as the containment unit the Dreamer was currently in. Wintour didn't have the finances to purchase something like that. When Albert had said that they would just grind the Dreamer down, he had lied. So, if the Dreamer refuses, we are essentially stuck? Nick asked. Well, Albert said as he scratched his chin. Not exactly. If, for some reason, the Dreamer completely refuses to work with you, you can still sell it. The Dreamer is not a newborn specter. I think it is in the mid, if not late, hatchling stage. That's worth quite a bit. Hatchling stage, Nick asked with a raised eyebrow. Oh yeah, Albert said. That's what we extractors call the different levels of the specters. The official designation is simply level-based. Level 1, 2, 3, and so on, but we extractors decided to come up with an unofficial one. Hatchlings are level 1 specters. Adolescents are level 2 specters. Adults are level 3 specters. Elders are level 4 specters. Fanatics are level 5 specters. Wow, wait, Nick said. Why are they suddenly called fanatics? Everything up to this point seemed to follow an age progression. Albert chuckled a bit. Mainly because level 5 specters and stronger have this thing where some people start worshipping them due to their power and influence. For example, the parasite has a secret cult, and all the manufacturers are trying their best to get rid of it since the cult kills people and delivers corpses to the parasite. Anyway, level 6 specters are demons. We call them like this due to their extreme power and danger. Level 7 specters are fallen. Level 8 specters are called adversaries, mainly because they pose the biggest problem to humanity as a whole. Really? Nick asked. What about the level 9 specters? First of all, there are fewer level 9 specters than level 8 specters. Second, the 5 level 9 specters are already an integral part of our lives, which we can't escape from. Their existence determines the baseline of humanity as a whole. So, in a bizarre way, the level 9 specters are not humanity's enemies, but the judges of humanity's prosperity. In contrast, we can still somewhat resist the level 8 specters, and the level 8 specters are doing their very best to suppress humanity. If you view humanity as a big company, you could view the level 8 specters as the chief executives and the level 9 specters as the owners. The owners very rarely come into contact with the employees, and they are rarely noticed by the employees, but when they arrive, even the chief executives have to be beyond respectful. In comparison, the chief executives are the ones making all the decisions and dictating how everyone feels. So, while the level 9 specters are more powerful, they do whatever they want, which means, in a way, they are not the collective enemy of humanity. It's a bit weird to explain. It's like one is a huge monster, and the other is a natural catastrophe. You can't really view a natural catastrophe as an enemy or fight it, you know? Nick scratched his chin. Oh, by the way, what are level 9 specters called? Eternal, Albert answered. They are just called Eternals. Nick nodded. Is there something similar for extractors? Albert nodded. Level 1 extractors are called newbies. Level 2 are called Johns. John? Nick asked with a raised eyebrow. Albert laughed. Yes, John. Level 2 extractors are the most numerous and most average. They used to be called John Doe, but it was shortened to just Johns. The most common and generic extractors get the most common and generic name. Johns, Nick repeated. You're serious? I am absolutely serious, Albert said with a suppressed chuckle. If everything works out, you will also become a John one day. Nick just blinked once. Chapter 33 Charge. After a while, Nick just sighed. It seemed like extractors were quite casual. What about level 3 extractors? Nick asked. Veterans, Albert answered. They already worked a lot with specters, which is why they are called veterans. Level 4 extractors are called experts. I'm an expert, Albert said with a smile. Level 5 extractors are called specialists. Crimson Fungus City has fewer than 30 of those. Level 6 extractors are called heroes. Heroes? Nick asked. Yep, because if there is something threatening the city, they are the ones saving us, and without them, this city wouldn't even exist, Albert explained. Without the heroes, all of us wouldn't be alive right now. Heroes represent the strongest existences we can get into contact with. Nick raised an eyebrow. But what about the level 7 and level 8 extractors? They're special, Albert said. Normal cities only have extractors up to level 6. Level 7 extractors count as legends, and they have dedicated their lives to helping humanity against the specters. Level 7 extractors are the ones keeping humanity safe from the fallen, the level 7 specters. There are less than 100 level 7 extractors. They are called the protectors. And as for level 8 extractors, Albert said before trailing off. Then he released a deep sigh. We are forever stuck with only having 7 of them. We will never be able to have more than 7. Why? Nick asked with furrowed brows. The Maw, Albert answered. The Maw just loves pitting similarly powerful extractors against each other, and it always takes 8. So if we ever get an 8th level 8 extractor, the Maw will take all of them. In the end, only one will come out. Meanwhile, there are over 40 level 8 specters. Nick became silent when he heard that. 7 versus over 40. The level 8 extractors were fighting a hopeless battle. And what are they called? Nick asked. Well, for all intents and purposes, they should be called heroes. But since normal people keep referring to level 6 extractors as heroes, we had to choose a different name. So, we decided to name them after what they are doing. They are unable to injure our enemy, but at least they are able to shield us from the worst our enemy can throw at us. That's why we call them shields. Nick remained silent for a while. He could feel how noble and selfless the 7 shields were. Without them, the adversaries, the level 8 specters, would have already run rampant. Is there a name for a potential level 9 extractor? Nick asked. Albert remained silent for a while. Well, a level 9 extractor would be able to resist the Eternals, and they would have the power to actually win against the specters as a whole. Someone like that could only be called our savior. Nick just nodded without saying anything. Level 7 and Level 8 extractors seemed to be very different from all the other extractors, according to what Albert had said. The weaker extractors were still working for the different cities and effectively running them. But Level 7 and Level 8 extractors were focusing on protecting humanity from the specters. However, Nick wasn't naive. He knew exactly that it wasn't possible that every single Level 7 extractor was some kind of selfless saint who dedicated their life to fighting for humanity. This meant that there were either more Level 7 extractors, or every Level 7 extractor was forced to fight for humanity. Nick wished that the second option was true, but he guessed that the first one was more likely to be true. The truly powerful people have a chance at actually changing the world for the better. Someone that has the power to change something should have a duty to change things. Quote, so many people want to change the world for the better but lack the power. Because of that, I believe that when you have the power, you have a duty to make the world a better place. I wouldn't be opposed to forcing the strong humans to fight for humanity. They don't need to sacrifice their lives, but they need to put in a real effort. Nick sighed. However, all of that doesn't matter. I am weak, and my opinion and actions have nearly no effect on the world as a whole. For now, I should focus on what's in front of me. Should we go back to the dreamer? Nick asked. Oh, has it been 3 hours already? Albert asked. Nick nodded. All right then, go in. Nick blinked a couple of times in surprise. You're not coming with me? Nope, Albert said. This is your specter. I showed you how to work with it and helped you a bit, but that was it. You're the chief Zephix extractor. You're the one in charge of all specters and extractors. It is your duty to manage the facility. If you can't keep the specters in check, you won't be able to get any Zephix from them, at which point you have to sell them, Albert explained. Nick took a deep breath. I understand. Naturally, Nick knew that he was the one in charge, but it was still difficult to come to terms with it. Nick had never led anyone, and he was still only 16 years old. Having the fate of an entire corporation hanging on his actions alone made his chest feel tight and his shoulders heavy. Usually, one could almost always ask someone more powerful or more experienced. A child could ask an adult about what to do. An employee could ask their supervisor. A supervisor could ask a manager. A soldier could ask an officer. And Nick? He was the one in charge. Well, technically, Wintour was in charge, but Wintour didn't have much to do with the specters themselves. I guess I have to learn to take control and to lead people, Nick thought with a sigh. It just feels so weird. I'm not entirely sure what I should do. Nick took a deep breath and stood up. Well, I won't get an answer by just thinking about it. Then, he walked towards the containment unit of the Dreamer. Chapter 34. Work. Nick operated the console and opened the entrance for the employees. The light in the containment unit sprang on, and Nick immediately saw the Dreamer after opening the door. The Dreamer was standing near one of the walls. Nick wasn't sure if he preferred this position over the one where the Dreamer just lay in the corner. Nick stepped into the containment unit with confidence, and the door closed behind him. Nick looked at the Dreamer. The Dreamer looked at Nick. Silence. Nick's heart began to race. At this moment, Nick's ability obviously didn't work, and the employee door took a couple of seconds to open. This meant that if the Dreamer decided to attack, Nick would have to fight it for a couple of seconds before Albert could get in or Nick out. I can't rely on Albert, Nick thought as he looked at the Dreamer with narrowed eyes. Albert is only here for today. Even if he saves me now, he won't be able to save me tomorrow. Remember, Albert said that specters always do what's most beneficial to them. The Dreamer is not powerful enough to escape from the containment unit. Even if it kills me, it won't be able to get out, and I'm certain it knows that. Because of that, attacking me would only antagonize the manufacturer it now belongs to, reducing our trust in it, and making its life more difficult. If I were in its position, I would want to play the good boy until I get enough Zephix to become a level 2 Spectre, an adolescent, before breaking out of the containment unit. The Dreamer and Nick were still silently looking at each other. The Dreamer had no expression whatsoever, and Nick had no idea what it was thinking or feeling right now. It just kept staring at him like a statue. I presume you are willing to work with us, Nick said. I think you would have attacked me if you didn't agree. Smart decision. The Dreamer just kept looking at Nick. We both know my power, and we both know that you are superior to me in every way, as long as you can see me. However, we also know that I can still avoid your attacks for a while, and compared to before, we are now on my home turf. I only need to survive until the door is open. The dreamer didn't do anything. Naturally, the dreamer's lack of reaction increased Nick's heart rate. It was just too creepy to look at something that was alive, but deliberately acted like it was not. Of course, you still have a genuine chance to kill me. The dreamer didn't do anything. But you have also noticed the alarms earlier, and I'm pretty sure you already figured out when the alarm gets triggered. If you decide to attack me, I will know before you actually attack. The dreamer just kept staring emotionlessly and silently. Ding, ding, ding. The next moment, the alarm rang, and Nick immediately put his hand on the console of the door behind him. However, he didn't press it. Instead, he only glared at the dreamer. Surprisingly, the dreamer just kept standing there. It was almost like it hadn't done anything. You get it now? Nick asked. Naturally, the dreamer had tested out the alarm. It wanted to know if the past activations had just been coincidences or not, and it didn't like what it saw. Whenever it was thinking about launching an attack, the alarm rang. The alarm activated so fast that the dreamer wasn't even sure whether or not it had actually wanted to attack. It felt very bizarre. It was almost like the alarm could tell the future. Okay, Nick said as he walked away from the door. Then, he slowly walked towards the dreamer. Since the dreamer currently stood on the ground, it seemed almost harmless. After all, it was just a barely 50-centimeter tall owl. Sure, it was quite a big bird, but that was it. However, Nick knew how powerful the dreamer actually was. Step by step, Nick closed in on the dreamer. Eventually, only a single meter separated them. The entire time, the two of them only looked into each other's eyes. Silence. The dreamer didn't attack. Naturally, Nick's heart rate was quite elevated at this moment, and adrenaline was coursing through his body. However, he also knew that he had to get through this. If he didn't manage to work with the dreamer, he couldn't call himself the chief Zephix extractor. He had to be able to work with the most powerful specters of the company. Good, Nick said. Then let's start working. The next moment, Nick turned around and walked to one of the walls. Then he sat down with his back to the wall. You gain power by giving people nightmares, right? The dreamer didn't answer. When you gain power, you give off the stuff we want. Albert, Nick shouted as he looked towards one of the walls, set the conversion rate to 90% for now. Some seconds passed. Done. Albert's voice came from one of the speakers in the corner. Nick nodded and looked back at the dreamer. For now, we will take 90%, and you get to keep 10%. Naturally, that is very much in our favor, but for now, that's your only option. If you prove to be trustworthy, we will allow you to retain more Zephix. After all, if you manage to become an adolescent, we will also get more Zephix. You growing stronger is also in our interest. But for now, we have to be careful of you. The next moment, Nick took a deep breath. I will try to fall asleep in here and you do your thing. However, keep in mind that I am currently the only person willing to work with you using this method. If I accidentally die, we will only have the bargain bin method left, and we might not trust you anymore, which means you stay a hatchling forever. Don't do anything stupid. And then, Nick closed his eyes. Chapter 35. Falling asleep. Nick's eyes remained closed. On the inside, Nick's heart was still racing, and he felt very nervous. But on the outside, he seemed calm. He wanted to open his eyes several times, but he forced them closed. Time passed. Clink. Nick's eyes slowly opened. Just now, the dreamer took a step forward, its black eyes fully focused on Nick's eyes. It was still as expressionless as earlier. Nick covertly took a very deep breath and closed his eyes. Clink. Nick's eyes remained closed. Clink. 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 The last two steps had come within a short moment from Nick's right side. He knew that the dreamer was currently standing directly beside him. Nick slowly opened his eyes and turned his head to the side. Black eyes. Nick's body shuddered as his vision was almost completely taken up by two black eyes. While sitting, Nick could almost see eye to eye with the dreamer, and right now, The dreamer's eyes were just 20 centimeters away from Nick's eyes. If the dreamer just used its beak to peck him, Nick would probably lose one eye before he could react. The more Nick looked into those eyes, the more he felt like they were empty. Usually when someone got more familiar with something, they managed to see subtle signs that told them more about the thing they were familiar with. Not here. The more Nick learned about the dreamer, the more he felt like he was just looking into an emotionless ghost or something similar. There was no disregard, hunger, rage, hatred, or whatever in its eyes. It was almost like it wasn't even conscious. It was like it was just a dead statue. But it wasn't, and that was why Nick felt so nervous right now. It felt wrong. Nick felt like the dreamer wasn't supposed to exist. It was not dead, but it didn't act like it was alive. Nevertheless, Nick took a deep breath and closed his eyes again. Time passed. Minutes passed. The dreamer had not moved ever since it had stepped beside Nick. After 30 minutes had passed, Nick wasn't even sure whether or not the dreamer was actually beside him. Usually one could feel when someone was right beside them. Breathing, slight movements, the change in the wind, the smell, some noise. None of that was here. The dreamer didn't breathe, smell, or move, and since there was also no wind in here, it also couldn't block it. It was like Nick was alone. Usually, Nick would prefer this feeling. After all, most people wanted to sleep alone. But the fact that he knew that the dreamer, a specter, was right beside him made it impossible for him to calm down. Nevertheless, Nick did his best to calm down. However, Nick knew that this state of affairs would continue for a long time. How am I supposed to fall asleep with that thing right beside me? It was difficult enough to sleep under normal circumstances, but it was even more difficult when something you didn't trust was looking right at you. But Nick tried. "Nick," came the quiet voice of Albert from one of the speakers. "Yes," Nick asked quietly. "The prefix levels are slowly rising, but my scanner says that they are not in preparation for an attack. You should inform the next person of this occurrence, lest they make a miscall and rush in. Tell me if you feel a change." Nick nodded slowly. "I will." Nick hadn't opened his eyes yet. Some moments later, Nick's mind was getting woozy. Images from what happened that day weaved in and out of his consciousness, and Nick felt like he was losing focus. The next moment, Nick yawned deeply. He was about to fall asleep. That was when Nick noticed it. He had just expected that he would be sitting here for hours. But now he felt very tired and was about to fall asleep. "I am getting very tired, and I think I will fall asleep soon, Albert," Nick said. "I think the dreamer is helping me fall asleep." "Noted," Albert said. "Just fall asleep. I'm here if anything happens. If you are still asleep after 8 hours, I will come in and wake you up." Nick yawned deeply again. "Sounds great. Good night," Nick said in a sleepy voice. Outside, Albert was looking at the console with a complex expression. "Yes, good night," he answered awkwardly. Albert just threw a glance out of the window, as if to confirm whether or not it was night. "Why am I even looking outside? I can only see the sun through the upper windows, and the sun isn't related to the time of day," Albert thought as he shook his head. Inside the containment unit, Nick felt his mind melt into different scenes. Today had been a very busy day. After waking up in the early morning, Nick and Wintour had prepared themselves for their excursion. At noon, Nick had jumped into the sewers, and he had continually been swimming in them for over 10 hours. Then, Nick had been tortured by the nightmare, which had significantly drained his mind. After that, Nick had fought the dreamer in a life-and-death battle before finally subduing it. And then, they even needed to walk several kilometers into the actual outer city, at which point they had a short scuffle with some guards. At least, Nick had been able to take a short nap in the healing bath. But after that, he had spent another 3 hours in the company itself. The fact that he had still been able to pay attention to Albert's teachings after that much had happened was surprising. And now, Nick had been over half an hour in the presence of the dreamer, while trying not to open his eyes. It was so much shit had happened today. But now, Nick felt calm. He could finally let go and get a good night's sleep. At this moment, for whatever reason, Nick had completely forgotten the presence of the dreamer right beside him. Some seconds later, Nick's back and legs became weak, and his body slumped. The dreamer kept looking at the sleeping Nick. On the outside, Albert looked at the different graphs on the console, and he took a deep breath when one of the graphs showed a curve traveling upward. This was the graph for Zephix production. At this moment, the dreamer was producing Zephix. Nick was successfully working with it. Chapter 36. Bad Dream. I'm sorry, please. I won't do it again. Nick shouted in absolute terror as he did his best to beg for his life on his broken legs. Bang. The next moment, Nick's face was kicked in by a metallic boot. Please, sorry, Nick cried through his crushed face. You are the reason why young Master Wintour is dead. One of the three armored people in front of him spoke. Your carelessness is why the Lord is now grieving. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry, Nick said through his crushed teeth. Bang! The metallic boot crushed Nick's forearm, and Nick began to scream even more. Nick tried to get his crushed forearm out from under the boot, which was grinding Nick's forearm into a crunchy paste of meat and bone. You think saying sorry will help you? The person spoke calmly and coldly through his black gas mask. But don't worry, you won't die today. The black gas mask was coming closer to Nick's face. You will stay alive for as long as the Lord commands it. He has many ways to keep you alive when your body begs to die. No. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, please. Nick just kept shouting garbled words through the crushed mess that had once been his face. Take him away, the man said as he turned around to walk away. No, no. Nick just kept shouting as the two other people grabbed him. The next moment, Nick found himself impaled onto a wooden cross with 3 spikes. 2 were going through Nick's wrists, and 1 was going through both his legs. Interesting, isn't it? The disfigured and small man in front of Nick said with a loud but awkward chuckle. This is the most popular and famous torture method from the old world, the torturer said. We found many depictions of this torture method in the ruins. You should consider yourself lucky. After all, not everyone gets to reenact such a monumental piece of history with their own body. After deciding for a while, the disfigured man took hold of a thin and small knife. Nick didn't show any reactions. All right, you know how this goes. Just don't move too much, okay? The man shouted with an awkward laugh. The next moment, the torturer stepped on a small ladder behind the cross and put the knife on the underside of Nick's right big toe. And then he cut into it. The knife methodically moved towards the center of Nick's foot. While this was happening, Nick's body was shuddering, but he wasn't saying anything. All right, that's the first one. Keep holding still. If you do a good job, you get a couple of days of peace in the drowning cage. Then the torturer slowly cut down from the second toe. Then the third, and so on. Eventually, all the cuts met in the middle of the underside of Nick's feet. Now, let's see. The next moment, the torturer grabbed both sides of one of the cuts and pulled to the side. Ride. After ripping them to the side a bit, the torturer took hold of the knife again, while the other hand kept Nick's skin off from his flesh. The next moment, the torturer slowly and carefully cut the connective tissue between Nick's skin and his flesh. Nick gritted his teeth, but they had already been filed into thin needles that weren't aligned with each other, essentially forcing them to dig into the opposite gums when he closed his mouth. Nevertheless, this was all Nick could do. Now look at this beautiful toe, the torturer said as the skin of Nick's big toe lay on top of Nick's toe like wrapping paper for a present. All right, let's do the second one. As Nick felt a sharp and intense pain come from his second toe, he just opened his eyes lifelessly. What greeted Nick was the sight of a human skin hanging from the ceiling a couple of meters in front of him. Besides that piece of skin were several more. There were over 10 sets of skins, all having different levels of quality. They had all belonged to Nick at one point. He had gone through this torture many, many times before. Whenever the torturer wanted another set, he would pull out Nick's skin and then bathe him in healing liquid. After that, Nick would get to relax in a cage that was almost completely underwater. Only by pursing his lips on the top could Nick get a bit of air, and only when the water was calm. And worst of all, they had cut out Nick's tongue and vocal cords to stop him from saying the sentence. This was his life. This was what his life would become. It was hopeless. It was eternal. The torture was never ending. Nick just closed his eyes again. Nick? Nick felt the reality shake. Hey, Nick. The next moment, Nick's mind began to swim, and he felt himself getting transported somewhere else. Nick opened his eyes, and he saw a white light shining onto him. Huh? Nick said in confusion. Nick's left arm moved upward and touched his head as he grimaced a bit. Everything all right? Albert asked. Yeah, I think so, Nick said as he slowly righted himself. I feel a bit confused and groggy. Also, I think I had a really bad dream, but I don't really remember. It's all foggy. Right? Nick said louder as he looked around the white room. He spotted the dreamer, standing in one of the corners, looking at him. Then, Nick to his left. Albert was standing left of him. Are 8 hours already up? Nick asked in a bit of confusion. Yep, Albert said. You slept very calmly. No one would think that you were going through a nightmare. You did go through one, right? Nick's brows furrowed. I think so. I feel all exhausted, and I feel like I cried and went through hell. But I can't remember. I know that something horrible has happened, but I just don't know what exactly. It's a strange feeling, Albert nodded. Well, whatever you went through worked. You produced a lot of Zephics, want to see. Nick slowly stood up and shook his head again. He was still tired. Yeah, sure. Chapter 37. Finances. Nick threw another glance at the dreamer, which was still looking at him with its emotionless eyes. Nick had no idea what the dreamer was feeling or thinking about. It was like a blank canvas. Then, Nick left the containment unit and followed Albert to the console. Albert pointed at a small monitor to the side of the console and slapped Nick's shoulders quite roughly. You seein' this? He shouted with excitement. Nick looked at the small monitor and saw the gauge of a tank. This was the Zephix tank of the Dreamer's containment unit. The gauge had a maximum volume of 50, and right now, it was at a bit over 5. You managed to get 5 grams of Zephix on your first time. That's amazing. Albert shouted with a laugh. Nick just looked at the gauge with confusion since he didn't know how much 5 grams of Zephix was. But Albert's enthusiasm also made him a bit excited. How much is 5 grams of Zephix? Nick asked. About 5,000 credits, Albert said with a smirk. Nick's eyes widened. How much? 5,000 credits? But the full-body healing bath only cost 4,800 credits, Nick said in a dumbfounded manner. Nick hadn't had issues with coming up with the taxes each month, but he had never owned more than 500 credits at a time. 500 credits had essentially counted as his life savings. And now he had made 5,000 just by sleeping a bit? If he just kept sleeping in there every single day, wouldn't he make over 100,000 credits per month? How much of that will I get? Nick asked. Depends on Wintour, Albert said. You have to remember that these 5,000 credits represent an entire day of operations for your company. 5,000 credits are quite a bit, but it's not that much if you want to run a small company. For example, just keeping the lights on in the containment unit for that long cost you around 650 credits. Nick's eyes widened. 650 credits for the lights. That's over 10%. Albert nodded. That's why this containment unit is so cheap. Almost all other containment units use shafts of mirrors to get natural light in them. Over a long period of time, the more expensive containment units are more cost-effective. Of course, after paying for the lights, you also have to pay the rent of the warehouse. Wait, rent? Nick asked in shock. I thought this warehouse belonged to us. Albert just laughed. Nick, do you have any idea how expensive such a big house is outside the dregs? If you want to buy the warehouse, you probably need more than 300,000 credits. Nick took a deep breath. Lighten up, Albert said. Compared to the light, the rent shouldn't be that bad. Based on the location and size, I would guess that Wintour pays somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 credits per month. That's less than 100 credits per day. It really isn't that bad, Nick thought. Then you have to pay Paytor. After all, he's an employee. Based on his profile, he probably also earns about 2,000 to 3,000 credits per month. That's also a bit less than 100 credits per day. After that, we need to consider expansion costs, Albert said. When you run a company, you keep the company's assets and finances separate from your personal ones. And since you guys want to expand at some point, you will probably save about 50% of the profit. The remainder will probably be split between the two of you. All in all, I expect that you get around 1,000 credits per day of work for yourself, Albert explained. Nick slowly nodded. 1,000 credits per day wasn't as much as 5,000 credits per day, but it was still an insane amount to Nick. 1,000 credits per day, Nick repeated with a distracted voice. Then, Nick remembered something. What about the dreamer? Can it actually produce Zephix once a day? Albert snorted. Nick, the dreamer is a specter that feeds on mentality. Compared to a specter that feeds on something physical, it doesn't need to digest its food. On top of that, specters don't need to sleep, breathe, or eat. The dreamer can probably go forever. Then, Albert pointed at Nick. But you can't. Nick furrowed his brows. Why not? I just slept for 8 hours, but I feel like I can continue sleeping. You shouldn't underestimate my ability to sleep. If I really want to, I can sleep a long time. Albert slowly shook his head. That's the issue. You just slept for 8 hours, but you feel like you can immediately continue sleeping. That doesn't sound very rested to me. Are you tired right now? Do you feel like you've had a good night's sleep? Nick looked at the ground with a thoughtful expression. His mind felt strained. It was almost like he had been awake for over 24 hours. Even more, Nick still felt like it was the same day he had entered the sewers, which felt strange. It's strange, Nick said. I feel like I haven't slept. Albert nodded. That's what I thought. Nick, sleeping is a natural process where the body cleans and organizes the mind while your body enters a resting state. The dreamer is changing that process by giving you nightmares. So, instead of your mind reorganizing, it has to experience more things and store more memories. This means that your mind is not essentially sleeping. Nick furrowed his brows with a frown. So, I have to sleep again, he asked, as he scratched the back of his head. Albert nodded. Yep, you have to actually go to sleep. Working with the dreamer is just that, work. It is not rest nor sleep. Nick could only sigh and nod. He could tell that Albert was right, and he accepted his explanation. At that moment, the door of the warehouse suddenly opened, and Nick looked over. The next moment, he saw Wintour standing beside Pator. Oh yeah, Albert said, like he just remembered something. I sent Pator to get Wintour about an hour ago or something like that. I thought he would want to know how things went. The distant Wintour turned to Pator, nodded, and told him something. Pator performed a short and polite bow and walked away from the warehouse. The next moment, Wintour walked into the warehouse, and the door ominously closed behind him. Wintour walked over and stopped in front of Albert and Nick. You're not wearing your uniform? Wintour asked Nick. Chapter 38, Murder. Nick's eyes widened. Right. I totally forgot. Then, Nick went over to the side of the warehouse. He had dumped his uniform in this place earlier. After all, it would be a bit awkward to enter the Dreamer's containment unit with a stack of clothing in his hands. I'll go put it on, Nick shouted as he ran behind the containment unit. Wintour just shook his head with a sigh. He's so different, Wintour said. To whom? Albert asked. The people in the inner city, Wintour answered. Albert chuckled a bit. Yes, but he's not that much different to how people in the dregs are. Well, he's a bit more altruistic than the average person. But I've seen my fair share of interesting events while teaching him in the dregs. Wintour didn't seem convinced as he continued looking at the containment unit. Are you sure? I thought since resources are so scarce, the people in the dregs are even more greedy and possessive than the people in the inner city, Wintour said. Albert hummed a bit. I wouldn't say so. Wintour raised an eyebrow as he looked at Albert. I think they are more open with their desires than the people of the inner city. It has a much greater impact when a friendly and nice person suddenly turns out to be a greedy asshole than when an asshole suddenly turns into a greedy asshole. Wintour blinked a couple of times. Strange metaphor, he stated. I mean, I think about the same number of people are selfish assholes in the inner city than in the dregs, but the selfish assholes that do exist are much easier to see in the dregs, making it seem like there are more. Makes sense, Wintour answered. However, there are also a lot of people like Nick, Albert added. In what way? People that are unhappy with the world but lack the power to change it, Albert said. Someone that still manages to retain humanity and empathy in a place where having these things is a luxury. There is no lack of bad people in this world, but in severe poverty, even the good people are forced to do bad things. Naturally, people with a lot of empathy can still see when someone doesn't want to hurt someone else, but is forced to in order to survive. That's a tragedy in and of itself. If things were different, these people wouldn't be forced into a dark path, and many victims would have never become victims. Nick has such a belief, Albert said. I know for a fact that he has already killed at least one person on purpose, but I also know that it will be very difficult for him to hurt someone who tries to hurt him but doesn't actually want to hurt him, if you get what I mean. Wintour raised an eyebrow in surprise. Nick has killed someone? He asked. Nick seemed like a very nice and idealistic teenager to him. Wintour couldn't connect this nice teenager to a murder. Albert nodded. Nick managed to survive on his own in the dregs for 6 years, and he even managed to build quite an impressive and athletic body. If you want such a body, you can't afford to lose 2 liters of blood per month. 80% of the people in the dregs can't pay their taxes every month. Even more, Nick managed to make the gangs his enemies, which would make it even more difficult for him to earn money. And yet he always managed to do it. Even more, you can't overlook his enmity with the gangs. The gangs are organized and powerful. Killing a single man is not difficult at all for them. But for some reason they are not willing to kill Nick, even though they don't like him. That can only mean that it isn't worth the price in their eyes, which means that they are certain that they will lose people to him, which in turn means they are certain that he can and will kill them. If the local rulers of the dregs are sure that Nick has killed someone, I am inclined to believe them. Wintour just looked at the containment unit with a concerned expression. Silence. Eventually, Wintour just sighed. Peter said that you have something important to report, he said, changing the subject. Albert grinned and took out a green flask, which he moved from side to side for a bit. Wintour just looked at the flask, not understanding what Albert was trying to convey. You don't get it? Albert asked. Wintour looked at the bottle for a couple more seconds. Sorry, no, I don't, Wintour said. Albert just chuckled a bit. I used that on the dreamer about 11 hours ago. At that moment, Wintour's eyes shot open in shock. I'm not paying for that, he immediately said. I know, Albert said. Wintour still looked warily at Albert. Why would you use a grade 4 healing potion on a level 1 specter? Wintour asked. I didn't use the entire thing, Albert said as he rubbed the back of his head. I only used a drop. Also because I got bored, and I wanted to teach Nick by actually showing him what to do instead of just telling him. Wintour's eyebrows rose in positive surprise. Oh, so can we earn money with the dreamer now? Albert just grinned and pointed at the gauge of the Zephix tank. Wintour looked at the gauge, and when he saw it, his eyes widened. 5 grams, he shouted. Yep, 5 whole grams, Albert said with a laugh. Wintour looked at the containment unit with wonder. And I basically had nothing to do with it, Albert said before pointing at the edge of the containment unit. It was all him. Wintour followed Albert's finger and looked over, and the next moment, Nick walked around the corner of the containment unit. When Wintour saw, he was taken aback by Nick's appearance. Meanwhile, Albert just smiled. Now, he looks just like a real extractor. Chapter 39. Card. Nick wore a red and black shirt with several pockets, and his pants were form-fitting and black. All in all, Nick looked quite sharp and competent. It was quite difficult to connect the current Nick to a person from the dregs. He basically looked like all the other Zephix extractors, which was a good thing since almost all Zephix extractors exhibited this aura of authority, status, and power. The only thing pulling down was his chaotic haircut. You look great, Albert shouted with a thumbs up. Wintour also nodded. Please keep the uniform clean and wear it when you have to work. Every Zephix extractor only gets 1 set. How am I supposed to keep it clean? Nick asked as he walked closer. You wash it, Albert said. With water? Nick asked. Meanwhile, Wintour raised an eyebrow in confusion. Yes, With water, Albert said. But water is for drinking. Why would I waste a good barrel of water just to keep my clothing clean? Nick asked like he had just heard the dumbest thing. Nick, Albert said with a deadpan voice, you earned something like 1,000 credits just now. A barrel of water doesn't even cost you 5 credits, and you can even wash your clothes several times with one. Albert, Wintour said before Nick could answer. Why wash it with water? I thought extractor uniforms are made to be washed with cleanser. The guy doesn't even want to waste water, Albert said, pointing at Nick with his thumb. You want to try to convince him to use something 100 times as expensive as water to wash his clothes? Also, it doesn't really matter when you get a cleansing shower in here. The problem will resolve itself anyway. I guess it makes sense, Wintour said. What's a cleanser and a cleansing shower? Nick asked. The blue bath before you take the green bath, Wintour answered. That's filled with cleanser. It's the blue liquid. A cleansing shower is a small room that pours cleanser all over you. Every manufacturer has a couple of those, since some specters can become stronger by coming into contact with matter from the outside. Since cleanser isn't very expensive for manufacturers due to their insane profits, they just force everyone that enters or exits a containment unit to take a cleansing shower beforehand as a precaution. We won't be any different since it's a negligible expense for an increase in security. Nick nodded a couple of times. Oh, okay, sounds fancy. Anyway, Wintour said as he walked closer to Nick with a smile. I just saw the 5 grams of Zephyx you produced. That's a lot. Nick smiled brightly when he heard that. Are we able to remain in operation indefinitely now? Wintour furrowed his brows as he evaluated some things. Kinda. Kinda? Nick asked. Well, if we were to remain on this level, we could continue indefinitely. But that's not our goal, is it? Nick raised his eyebrows in unsure concern. I guess not. No, it isn't, Wintour said with a firm tone. The bare minimum we want to achieve is to earn 50 to 100 million credits so that I can buy a small part of Kugelblitz. If we were to operate in this manner indefinitely, that would take decades. We need more profit. We need to optimize Zephyx production with the Dreamer and expand our scope of operations, catching specters, containing specters, employing people, paying rent, buying containment units, and so on all costs money. And one Dreamer just isn't enough to pay for all of this. Nick raised an eyebrow in concern. He understood that Wintour wanted to become an heir to his family, but he also couldn't understand why someone would need that much money. They were already earning 1,000 credits per day. Nick could literally do everything he wanted with that much money. Okay, we can do that, Nick said after a bit. Good, Wintour answered with a smile. Now you've had a long day behind you, and I think you deserve a break. Naturally, I want to produce more money with the Dreamer, but I think it's important that you get a couple of days to yourself. Why don't you take the next 3 days off to recover? Maybe go look around for some houses in the outer city. Maybe meet some friends? Maybe go buy something. In short, relax, Wintour said, putting his hand on Nick's shoulder. The next moment, Wintour took out a small card and pushed it into Nick's hands. Nick looked at the card and noticed that it looked very similar to the card that the guard had used to pay for Nick's bath. It's yours, Wintour said. Nick looked at the card with wonder. If you want to buy something, just hand it to the seller. But be careful which shops you frequent. Some of the sleazier shops might decide to exchange your card for a counterfeit. Nick just continued looking at the card. How much is it worth? 100,000 credits. See it as a hiring bonus, Wintour said. Nick's eyes shot open. 10,000 credits. What was he supposed to do with that much money? Nick reflexively tried to hand the card back to Wintour, but Wintour just shoved it back into Nick's hands. It's yours, Nick, Wintour said. You're my chief Zephyx extractor, and today you made 5,000 credits for the company. Within 2 weeks, my and your personal wealth will increase by another 10,000 credits as long as you keep working diligently. Nick looked with uncertainty at Wintour, and then looked at his card. Yes, what Wintour said made a lot of sense, but Nick still felt strange about just accepting 10,000 credits. Logically, he knew that he would earn the company much more, but emotionally, he felt like he didn't deserve that much money. Well, it seems like everything's going well here, Albert said from behind them. I think it's time for me to leave. Wintour turned to Albert and gave him a respectful handshake. Thank you again for your help today. No problem, Albert said. Then, Albert turned to Nick. See you at some point, Nick. Nick was taken out of his thoughts and looked at Albert. Oh yeah, thanks again, Albert. Without you, this wouldn't have been as easy. I know, Albert said with a smile. See ya. Then, Albert walked out of the warehouse. A couple minutes later, Nick also left the warehouse. Wintour had essentially thrown him out of the warehouse, telling him that he should relax for the next 3 days. Nick just absent-mindedly walked away from the warehouse. He just kept looking at his card. Chapter 40, Horua. Nick just aimlessly walked back to the dregs with a disoriented expression. 1,000 credits. 3 days of nothing to do. Nick had achieved his dream. He had become a Zephix extractor. He was earning a lot of money. He didn't need to fear for his life anymore. Well, outside of being in the Dreamer's containment unit. And yet, there was a certain emptiness in Nick's chest. It was almost like all of this wasn't real. Literally just 2 days ago, Nick had been poor and had spent all of his life in the dregs. Now, Nick was wearing nice clothes, and he had even taken a fancy bath. Even more, he was rich. Eventually, Nick just stopped walking. By now, he had already reached the dregs again, and he had stopped in the middle of a random road. Nick just looked around the area. He saw a couple of people, but they all avoided him. None of them dared to look at him, and the few that had to travel past him either waited for him to leave or passed him with a wide berth. There was fear and nervousness in their faces. Nick felt the distance between him and the people around him widen. In a way, Nick felt like he had been thrown out of his home. Just a couple days ago, no one had batted an eye when he had been walking through the dregs. But now everyone was looking at him from a distance with fear. I guess this is what happens, he thought with a sigh. I look like a Zephix extractor now, and all Zephix extractors get such looks. What am I saying? I don't look like a Zephix extractor. I am a Zephix extractor. This is what I have always dreamed of. Nick looked around the area with newfound motivation. But the more he looked at the people, the more isolated he felt. Eventually, Nick sighed again before continuing to walk. After a couple of minutes, Nick reached his goal. In front of Nick was a sizable house made of rusty metal. But compared to most houses, this one was quite a lot bigger. It was almost a mansion. It was Nick's current home. Nick opened the door and walked inside. The house smelled just like the dregs outside, but Nick didn't mind. He was used to the smell of rust, shit, piss, and toxic waste. Nick, came the voice of a young boy from upstairs. A boy about 11 years old walked down the steps. But as soon as he saw the person standing at the entrance of the house, the boy stopped in shock. "Yes, sir? How can I help you?" the boy asked with a fearful voice. "It's me, Horua," Nick said. "And Nick?" Horua, the boy asked in shock. Horua was the actual owner of the big house. Horua was the only child of a quite rich man in the dregs, which meant that he was earning about as much as the average person in the outer city. He had only needed to save enough money to move out of the dregs, but before he could do so, he vanished. After some weeks, the gang started to covet the man's old house and closed in on it. Naturally, Horua couldn't resist them. But then, Nick intervened, and he defended Horua. However, while Nick was a nice person, he was also a practical one. To say that Nick only helped the little boy out of the goodness of his heart would be a lie. Nick saw Horua's troubles as a good way to earn some money without having to commit horrible acts. In exchange for a place to live and his tax money, Nick made sure that no one dared to take anything from the house or hurt Horua. For the past months, Nick had been living here. "Is that really you?" Horua asked. Nick nodded. "Yep," he said as a smile appeared on his face. "I'm officially a Zephix extractor now." "Cool, huh?" Horua looked with shock at Nick as he slowly walked closer. For several seconds, Horua just looked at the uniform like it was a valuable gem. "Wow," Horua eventually let out. "That's amazing." But then, the little boy realized something. "Wait, so does that mean that you won't be living here anymore?" Nick furrowed his brows. He didn't answer. Nick had often thought about moving out of the dregs, but when it finally became a reality, it felt like it had happened way too soon and quickly. "I guess so," Nick said after a while. Horua became a bit worried, and he looked at the ground. With Nick gone, the gangs would return, and he would lose his house. Even more, maybe the gangs would even take revenge on Horua for all the troubles Nick had caused them due to him. Horua was just an 11-year-old boy, and he was very scared of the gangs. Horua felt like he would soon die, but he also knew that Nick actually had no obligation to help him. "And will happen to me?" Horua asked. "What about Dad's house?" Nick sighed. "I don't know about the house, but I can make sure that the gangs won't hurt you. I can probably also store your credits somewhere." Horua's eyes widened in fear. He knew how much everyone coveted his father's money. And after becoming a Zephix extractor, Nick was suddenly willing to store Horua's money? Horua became suspicious, but he still trusted Nick. After all, Nick had been protecting him for months. For the next couple of minutes, Nick and Horua talked about what to do. In the end, Horua could only sigh and accept that he wasn't strong enough to protect his own money. "If I remain on my own, I will lose my money with certainty. If I trust you, there's still a chance," Horua said. Nick wasn't offended that Horua didn't fully trust him. After all, they were both living in the dregs. "If only there were a way for me to also become a Zephix extractor and get an ability that makes me powerful." When Nick heard that, he got an idea, and he scratched his chin in thought. Chapter 41, Quest for Food. "I might have a way to help you, but it won't be easy," Nick said with a thoughtful expression. Horua opened his eyes widely in surprise. "You do?" he asked. Nick nodded. "I mean, I'm the chief Zephix extractor in a company, and we still need to optimize the Zephix production of one of our specters." "Horua, would you be interested in becoming a Zephix extractor?" Nick asked. Horua's eyes opened even more, but this time with wonder. "Me? A Zephix extractor?" Nick nodded with a smile. "Why not?" "But I just turned 11, Horua said with a bit of nervousness. Nick just laughed. "So, why not start early? Even more, it's not even difficult to work with that specter. You basically just have to fall asleep in its presence. Additionally, since your Zephix synchronizer hasn't been attuned yet, you should also get a nice ability from it. As long as you don't die, nothing bad can happen." Horua looked at Nick like he couldn't believe what he had just heard. "Are you sure? Can I really become a Zephix extractor?" "Of course," Nick said with a chuckle. "You will gain an ability, a stable job, and lots of money. You might not earn as much as me, but you will still earn more than everyone in the dregs." Horua started to jump up and down in excitement. Thank you so much. You're the best, Nick." Nick just laughed some more. He always enjoyed it when Horua was excited. Due to Horua's bad situation, he was rarely happy. Whenever Nick wasn't present, Horua was worried and stressed. He even had trouble sleeping due to all the pressure. "Anyway, I apparently have 3 days of vacation for now, which means I can't take you there right now. But after my vacation is over, I'll take you to your future workplace." "You're going to see a real specter, Horua," Nick said with a laugh. "Wow, a real specter," Horua echoed in wonder. The two of them talked some more, but a couple of minutes later, Nick left the house again. Earlier, Nick had felt aimless. He hadn't known what he should do with his newfound freedom. But now, that problem had been solved. Nick could use his position to help one of his friends out. It feels good to do good deeds. Now, since the problem with Horua has been solved, I should take a look at some houses in the outer city, Nick thought with excitement. But before long, Nick stopped. Grumble. "You know, I'm actually quite hungry. I think I haven't eaten anything in like a day or so," Nick thought. "What do I want to eat today? Rat? Fly? Some veggie cubes from the market? I can now buy a lot of them with my money. I could also go with rust mushroom, but I don't really want to. It tastes a bit too acidic for me. Although, the house does have a ripe colony of rust mushrooms, and if I don't eat it soon, it will turn toxic and start releasing toxic spores." Nick scratched the back of his neck. "I should just check out the market," he thought with a shrug. Nick changed direction and walked towards the market of the dregs. As soon as he arrived, most people turned to him. Why was a Zephix extractor here? Nick tried his best to ignore the stares, but they still pulled his mood down a bit. In the end, Nick entered one of the shops at the side of the market. He had only gone into some of them due to a job, but he had never bought anything there. The things in these shops were just too expensive. The shop Nick had entered had many different pieces of food lying around. There was rat, cat, dog, fly, and bird, and they even had several different kinds of veggie cubes. The selection was amazing. "H, how can I help you, sir?" the owner of the shop asked Nick as soon as he entered. "Hey, I'm hungry. Do you have anything good to eat?" he asked. The owner of the shop looked with confusion and suspicion at Nick. Yes, but I'm not sure if my wares have the quality your tongue desires, sir," he said with a bitter smile. Nick just waved his hand to signal that it wasn't a big deal. "Just tell me what tastes good in here." The owner of the shop became more nervous. "Well, I made a new cauldron of veggie cube soup. I'm not sure if Sir is interested in veggie cubes, though. Sir is probably more familiar with real vegetables." "Real vegetables?" Nick repeated with surprise. "Oh, right. I totally forgot that there are supposed to be real vegetables somewhere. Do you have any?" The shop owner became more nervous. This Zephix extractor was acting very strangely. Was this some kind of scheme or technique to get some information out of the shop owner? The extractor's conduct made no sense. Nevertheless, the shop owner had no chance but to go along with it. "Sadly, no, sir," the shop owner said. "No one in the dregs would buy them due to the price." "Oh, okay," Nick said. "Then give me some of that veggie cube soup." "Of course, sir," the shop owner said as he quickly walked over to a cauldron. The owner took the lid off, and Nick could smell the aroma. It smelled absolutely amazing. The next moment, the owner took out a bowl made of rusty metal and scooped some of the soup out of the cauldron. "That will be 10 credits, sir," the owner said nervously as he put the bowl down on the counter. 10 credits were 10% of the monthly tax. Only rich people in the dregs could afford to eat something this luxurious. The majority of the shop's customers probably came from the gangs. Nick took out the card he had received from Wintour and placed it on the counter. When the shop owner saw the card, he smiled bitterly. Sir, we can't trade with bank cards in the dregs. I'm not allowed to collect the outstanding balance from the banks since I am living in the dregs." Chapter 42, Sightseeing. Nick exited the shop with a bowl of veggie cube soup in his hands. When Nick had canceled the order after realizing that he couldn't pay, the owner said that the bowl was on the house. As a practical person, Nick saw no problem with that, and simply accepted happily. Nick also told the owner that he could ask Nick for help if there was anything he needed. After leaving the marketplace quite quickly, Nick looked at the bowl of veggie cube soup in his hands with wonder. In the dregs, the people mostly ate meat. Rat, cat, dog, insects, and so on. However, it was also necessary to eat some veggie cubes every now and then. Veggie cubes were green cubes made of different vegetables, which could no longer be sold in the outer city. When vegetables started to go bad, the shops sold them to one of the gangs, which then collected them all, threw them into some kind of furnace, and cooked them until there was 0 water left in them. One cube weighed about 100 grams and cost a credit. It was expensive. Because of that, the people in the dregs only ate them once a week or so. If they didn't, they would start to show various signs of malnourishment. The bowl of veggie cube soup was beige in color, and there was some kind of oily layer on top, which seemed to have separated from the soup. The cubes had turned into slimy and mushy bits that swam in the beige broth. Nick could also see a couple of mosquito larvae swimming in the broth. These were not the larvae of normal mosquitoes, but the larvae of the mosquitoes that belonged to the specter, the mosquito. The mosquitoes of the specter continually reproduced, and apparently, the specter didn't mind if anyone ate the larvae. In fact, they mostly could be found in the dregs, and they were very healthy, but they were also expensive. The larvae from these mosquitoes were much bigger than the ones from normal mosquitoes. Each one was around 5 centimeters long. When Nick saw the soup, he knew that he was holding something of extremely high class in his hands. "No wonder this thing is so expensive," Nick thought with wonder. It has 4 or 5 larvae, and probably over 300 grams of veggie cubes. That's enough food for 2 to 3 days. Nick slowly pushed the bowl to his mouth and drank the warm broth. The fat had separated from the water, and the larvae had a bitter and metallic taste to them. The distant taste of vegetables could also be slightly discerned. Nick closed his eyes in bliss. It was amazing. He had never eaten anything this good in his entire life. Also, what is this strong taste? I can't put my finger on it. Wait, is that rustlick? In Nick's mind appeared the image of a big rock standing near the edge of the city. That rock was made from a magical mineral that could treat some special conditions that caused dizziness, nausea, and vomiting. The people just needed to lick the rock for a bit, and they would feel better. Nick had heard some people refer to it as salt, but it was commonly known as rustlick, since people licked it off a dirty stone. Putting rustlick into a soup. That's genius, Nick thought. It tastes so amazing. Over the next hour, Nick slowly consumed the broth, and after he was done, he felt so incredibly good. Nick felt like his body was telling him how happy it was. This is the life, Nick thought in satisfaction. If I could eat this soup every day, I could die happy. A moment later, Nick yawned. Man, now I'm getting tired. Guess I should go back home and get some sleep. Nick stretched and turned to walk home. After he arrived, Nick entered his room and fell onto his comfy plate of rust-free metal. His entire body relaxed as he felt the comfortable embrace of sleep take him. Several hours later, Nick woke up again, and this time he felt awake and refreshed. He slept amazingly. After he woke up, he slowly scratched the back of his head in relaxation. Man, I feel great, he thought with a yawn. So, what do I do today? After some time of thinking, Nick decided to look at the outer city. For the entire day, Nick went sightseeing in the outer city, and he learned many things. For example, he had learned how many different kinds of shops there were. There were actually shops that sold expensive stones that had no other purpose but to look nice. It was insanity. Why would anyone pay money to carry a stone with them? Nick had also learned that there were places where he could sleep without making them his home. These places were called hotels. Hotels didn't exist in the dregs, since there were more houses than people, but the same thing wasn't true for the outer city. After finding out about the hotels, Nick decided to rent a room for a couple of days and got Horua to come with him. Nick didn't want to spend all his time alone, and he also wanted to have someone with him that he was familiar with. Nick even visited several restaurants, but he didn't eat at any of them. The prices were ridiculous for only a little bit of food. 10 credits for 150 grams of meat. He could get that for free by just stomping on a couple of bugs. The soup he had eaten the day before had weighed nearly a kilo, including the broth, and the ingredients had weighed over 400 grams. Eventually, Nick got some physical credits from a bank, and he ate more of the veggie cube soup with Horua. The day after that, Nick and Horua looked around the outer city some more, and finally, it was time to return to work. It was time for Horua to work with the dreamer. Chapter 43, I Want. It's great, isn't it? Nick asked. Horua just stood in front of the huge warehouse, his eyes filled with wonder. A Zephix manufacturer. He was in front of a Zephix manufacturer, and he was about to become an employee of one. Let's go in, Nick said with an encouraging smile. Right now it was early in the morning. Nick had decided to come during the afternoon because of Horua's sleep schedule. It was better for Horua to sleep during the night, which was why they had arrived this early. Working with the dreamer might seem like rest, but it isn't actually rest. Because of that, Nick wanted to get one session of work in before they went home to sleep. The two of them entered the warehouse, and Horua looked at the huge wall of metal in front of him. Is that where it is? He asked. Nick nodded. Yup. Sadly, I can't tell you any specifics without Wintor. Horua just nodded, showing that he understood. A moment later, Horua noticed a tall man with light brown hair sitting in front of a desk. Right now there were many different sheets of paper on the desk, and the man was looking at them with furrowed brows. You're a bit early, Wintor said with a smile, not looking up from the sheets of paper. Yep, Nick answered with a chuckle. Also, I brought someone that I want to make into one of my Zephix extractors. Oh, Wintor said as he looked up from his papers. Yet when he saw the small boy, he furrowed his brows. "Are you talking about him?" "Yep," Nick said with a nod. Nick pushed Horua forward a little bit, and Horua looked at Wintour with respect and fear. "Hello, sir. I want to become a Zephix extractor," Horua said, managing not to stutter. Wintour looked with an unsatisfied gaze at Horua. "How old are you?" 11, sir," Horua said politely. "Do you have any family?" Horua was a bit surprised by the question, and even Nick raised an eyebrow in confusion. No, sir," Horua answered. "I assume you are from the Dregs," Wintour asked. Horua nodded. "Yes, sir." "Are you a member of any organization or gang?" "No, sir," Horua said. "What's this all about?" Nick asked. "Why are you asking all of these questions?" "These questions have a purpose, Nick," Wintour said without looking at him. "Would anyone come searching for me if you died in here?" Wintour asked. This question made Horua quite nervous, and even Nick furrowed his brows. However, Nick remained quiet. "No, sir," Horua said with a bit of fear and sadness. Wintour continued looking at Horua with an unhappy expression. "Nick, I need to speak with you privately," Wintour said before standing up and walking behind the containment unit. Nick looked suspicious and unhappy, but he just followed. Horua was left alone in front of the containment unit. "Nick, do you actually know what you're doing?" Wintour asked with a raised eyebrow. "Please elaborate," Nick said. "He's a kid, Nick," Wintour explained. "Just because you managed to withstand the Dreamer doesn't mean that everyone can. There are many cases of extractors dying while working with a specter that feeds on mentality when they actually shouldn't have. Too much stress can stop your heart or shut your brain down. I asked all these questions earlier because I wanted to make sure that no one would be searching for us in case the Dreamer killed him." Nick furrowed his brows. "So, we can't employ him?" he asked. "Technically, that's not my decision," Wintour said. "Not your decision?" Nick asked with a raised brow. "I am the president and CEO. I don't deal with personnel issues unless they are directly related to me," Wintour said. "You are the chief Zephix extractor. It is your duty to build a team of capable Zephix extractors and assign the specters to them. If you want to employ this boy, you are free to do so. However, if something happens, that's on you. If the Dreamer accidentally kills him, it is your fault, and you have to take responsibility and deal with the aftermath." When Nick heard that, he felt his chest tighten. Just now, the image of a dead Horua shot through his mind. "I need to talk to him again," Nick said. "All right," Wintour answered neutrally. "If you decide to employ him, tell me, and I will give you our standard contract." "Does he know anything about the Dreamer, or how we obtained it?" Nick shook his head. "No." For some reason, Wintour's eyes seemed to show some relief. "Good." The next moment, the two of them walked to the front of the containment unit again. Wintour went back to his desk while Nick went over to Horua. Horua looked with anxiety at Nick. "Listen, Horua," Nick said. "I want you to know that becoming a Zephix extractor is not without its dangers. If you decide to become a Zephix extractor, you might undergo a short period of horrifying pain. The pain might become so bad that you could die." Horua took a deep breath when he heard that. "Your survival is not guaranteed, Horua," Nick said with a serious expression. "But if you manage to survive, you will become a Zephix extractor here. But you might also die. Are you sure you want to become a Zephix extractor here?" "It is not too late to turn around," Nick said solemnly. Horua seemed quite worried as he looked at the ground. Naturally, he was very scared. "I will do it," Horua said as he looked into Nick's eyes with desperation. "There's nothing left for me in the Dregs. My parents are dead. I've never had siblings. I don't have a family. I don't have friends except for you. It's now or never. Nick, I want to make something of my life." Nick kept looking at Horua with a serious expression. "Are you sure?" he asked again. "I am sure," Horua answered. "I am strong, and I have a lot of willpower. I can deal with pain." Some seconds passed, and then Nick nodded. "Wintour, give me the contract." Chapter 44, Horua and the Dreamer. Wintour looked at Horua, sighed, and handed Nick 2 sheets of paper. One of them was an NDA, which made sure that Horua wouldn't tell anyone about the company's secrets, and the other one was the employee contract. Nick took the NDA and started to read it to Horua. "Nick, you don't have to read it to me. I can read myself," Horua said. Nick's eyes widened in surprise. "You can read?" he asked in shock. Horua nodded. "Father taught me when I was young." "Well, okay," Nick said as he handed the NDA over. Horua read through everything in just a couple of minutes and nodded. A moment later, he signed it. "You have no questions?" Nick asked in surprise. "I just can't tell anyone about anything specific, right?" Horua asked. Yeah, sure. That's about it," Nick said. Horua nodded and grabbed the actual contract. After reading through it, Horua became shocked. "I get to keep 10% of what I produce," he asked. "Isn't that a lot of money?" Nick also looked at the contract since it was different from his own. Sure enough, Horua got to keep 10% of what he produced. This meant that he would get 500 credits per session with the Dreamer. Nick asked Wintour about the specific split of revenue. "As the CEO and president, I get 20%, Wintour said. 10% go to you. 10% go to the specific extractor that produced everything. 60% go to the company as funds." Initially, Nick was a bit confused. If Horua got 10% and Nick got 10%, then wouldn't Nick earn just as much as Horua? Wasn't he the chief Zephix extractor? But then, Nick realized that he would get the money without actually doing anything, and if he himself worked with the Dreamer, he would get just as much as Wintour. "So if I get more extractors, I get even more money. It's like other people are doing my work." However, Nick also wasn't super comfortable with that. "I am essentially taking money from someone without doing anything. Isn't that like stealing? I mean, I didn't do anything." Nick looked at the containment unit. "Although, I came up with the way to work with the Dreamer, and I was also the one that negotiated with it. So, I guess in a way I actually did do something," Nick thought with uncertainty. "I don't know. I mean, okay, but it still feels a bit weird," he thought as he scratched the back of his head awkwardly. Eventually, Nick stopped thinking about all of the moral ramifications and just watched Horua sign the employee contract. "Good," Nick said with a bright smile as he handed the signed contract to Wintour, who wordlessly put it into a briefcase beside his chair. "You're now officially one of my employees," Nick said with a bright smile. "Happy to meet you, boss." Horua shouted with a bright voice as he performed a cute salute. Nick put his hand on Horua's head and ruffled his hair a bit. "All right then, let me tell you about what we do here and what your job will be." Horua nodded and listened with excitement. Over the next minutes, Nick told Horua everything he knew about the Dreamer. "So I just have to sleep beside it?" Horua asked in surprise. Horua had thought that his work would be much more difficult than just sleeping. "Yep," Nick said with a smirk. "The Dreamer will even help you fall asleep. Although you still have to be careful. After all, it is a specter." Horua blinked. "Nick, what am I supposed to do if it decides to attack me?" Nick didn't answer for a while. Right? What was Horua supposed to do? Even Nick could die if the Dreamer decided to attack. What could the little Horua do? It probably won't happen," Nick said with a nervous chuckle. "It knows exactly that it can't just kill you. It wouldn't be in its best interest." Horua looked worried again. "Anyway, I think I should introduce you," Nick said as he walked towards the containment unit. "To whom?" Horua asked. "Whom?" Nick asked. "You mean who, right?" "No, it's whom," Horua answered. "To whom will you introduce me to?" "What? Why? What even is whom?" Nick asked. "I don't know, but my father always corrected me," Horua said. "Anyway, to whom?" "The Dreamer," Nick said. "Wait, what? Now?" Horua asked nervously. Nick nodded. "Yep." Horua looked around nervously, but he eventually followed Nick. "Well, you're the boss." Nick nodded and opened the employee door to the containment unit. A couple seconds later, Nick and Horua entered the containment unit. Horua was standing a bit behind Nick, but as he looked past Nick's torso, he could see the Dreamer. The black owl was standing in the corner of the room, looking into Nick's eyes. Nick had narrowed his eyes and was looking back at the Dreamer. A bit later, the dreamer turned its head and looked at Horua. When Horua saw the dreamer look at him, a cold shudder of terror shook his body. These eyes, for some reason, Horua felt like he was about to die. This thing was dangerous. He had to leave. He had to run. Nick noticed Horua's reaction and grabbed his arm before he could run away. Horua just kept looking at the dreamer as his body leaned back, ready to run away as soon as he could. The dreamer didn't show any reaction. "Horua," Nick shouted aggressively. Horua's body shook, and his terrified eyes looked at Nick. "You are now a Zephix extractor. You have to be brave and meet the danger head-on." Horua took a deep breath and tried to calm down. However, when he looked at the dreamer again, his fear exploded once more, and he tried to pull himself out of Nick's grip. "Horua, what's going on with Arg?" Nick's question was interrupted by Horua biting Nick's hand. Naturally, Nick let go of Horua, and Horua ran out of the containment unit in terror. Nick furrowed his brows and looked at his slightly bleeding hand. What the hell is wrong with him? Nick thought. Nick looked at the dreamer. The dreamer looked back. "I'll be back soon." Then, Nick walked out of the containment unit. Chapter 45. Liability. Nick left the containment unit and saw Horua trying to open the door of the warehouse. "Horua," Nick shouted with anger as he ran over. When Horua heard Nick's angry voice, his entire body shuddered before freezing. Nick quickly arrived behind Horua and forcefully turned him around to face him. Horua looked into Nick's eyes with terror. "What's wrong with you?" Nick shouted. I... Horua stuttered. "Nen, no, I can't." "Horua," Nick shouted again. "Get a grip. It's just the dreamer. It didn't even do anything. It just looked at you." The dreamer's dead eyes shot through Horua's mind again, and his body shuddered. "Horua," Nick shouted again. Horua was forcefully pulled out of his terror by Nick's shout. "Nick, I changed my mind. I don't want to be a Zephix extractor anymore. I want to go home." Nick looked with shock at Horua. "What? Why? You said you were willing to face the danger head-on. You said you have willpower and want a chance to make something of your life." Horua just shook his head wildly. "No, I can't. I will die. I can feel it. I will die. I don't want to see this monster again. It will kill me, Nick. I can feel it. It will kill me." "Horua," Nick shouted again as he shook Horua's little body a little. "Calm down. You have to calm down." Surprisingly, shouting at Horua to calm down actually seemed to work, and Horua took a couple of deep breaths. "Nick, I can't go back in there. I will die. I know it. I feel it," Horua pleaded. Nick looked with furrowed brows at Horua. "Come on, Horua," Nick said with a calmer voice. "It's just a big owl. You will go to sleep, have a little nightmare, and you will wake up rich. Even more, you also get an ability since your Zephix synchronizer will get attuned to the dreamer," Nick explained. "Just one little session with the dreamer would forever change your life for the positive. Don't throw this opportunity away." Horua didn't immediately answer, and he just looked at the ground in front of him. Silence. As the seconds passed, Horua's breathing quickened, and his body began to shudder again. "No," Horua said with conviction as he looked into Nick's eyes. "I'm not going back in there." Nick looked at Horua with a concerned expression. "Are you sure?" "Yes, I'm sure," Horua shouted. The next moment, Horua looked back at the ground. "Can't we just go back home, Nick?" Nick took a deep breath. "I have to talk to Wintour," Nick said. "Thank you," Horua said quietly, as he only looked at the ground in fear and shame. Even though Horua felt fearful, he also felt like he had disappointed Nick. Horua wanted to face the dreamer, but whenever he thought of the dreamer's eyes, his body and soul refused to interact with it in any way. Nick walked over to Wintour and sighed. "Sorry, but Horua resigns." Wintour put the sheets of paper down and looked at Nick with a serious expression. "The kid is a liability," Wintour said. Nick sighed. "I know. Sorry for wasting your time. I've always seen how brave he was, and I thought that he could work with the dreamer. After all, the dreamer is basically just a big owl." Wintour wordlessly looked into Nick's eyes with an emotionless expression. "I thought he could handle it," Nick added. But in the end, he is just a child. Nick sighed. I should have known. This is my fault. Sorry. Wintour kept looking at Nick. A couple of seconds of silence passed, and Nick became a bit uncomfortable under Wintour's emotionless gaze. I think you didn't understand what I meant, Nick, Wintour said. Nick looked with a bit of confusion and worry at Wintour. What do you mean, he asked. Nick, why do you think I asked the boy about his family, friends, and social circle? Wintour asked. Nick's heart rate increased, but he didn't say anything. Because of you, Wintour explained. If things went sour, I want the consequences to be as little and unimportant as possible. I have no issues with letting an experienced extractor resign. They have experience and are an adult. They know what it means to break an NDA. But he's just a kid. You saw what happened when he saw the dreamer. Kids don't know what they feel or think most of the time. They don't have enough experience to evaluate themselves objectively. You saw how motivated and excited he was when he told you that he would change his life and work with the dreamer. But as soon as he met him, he ran away in fear. The same might happen with the NDA. Of course, the punishment for breaking the NDA is death. But the boy isn't an adult yet. He might believe that he will get away with it as long as he makes the other person promise that they won't tell anyone else. At that point, the damage is already done. Nick's chest tightened in anxiety, but he did his best to seem calm. So what's your plan? Nick asked. How can we solve this issue? Wintour wordlessly looked into Nick's eyes again for a while. Nick's heart rate increased even more. How about making him sign another contract? Nick asked. One that makes it even more difficult to break the NDA. What about sending Pator to keep an eye on Harua? I will even pay for it with my own money. What if I just continue living with him until he becomes ready to face the dreamer for real? Wintour didn't answer. He just kept looking at Nick emotionlessly. Nick, the boy is a liability. His continued existence is a danger to the company. There are only two ways this will go. 1. He does not leave this warehouse and becomes an official Zephix extractor by working with the dreamer. 2. I will make Pator escort him home, and on the way home, the boy will accidentally fall through the grates in the dregs. But he will be dead before he hits the water. I will not put my company in the hands of an 11-year-old child's ability to keep a secret. Chapter 46, Responsibility. Nick's mind nearly stopped. Harua would get killed. What? Tell me you're joking, Nick said evenly. I'm not joking, Wintour said. Are you insane? Nick shouted. In the distance, Harua heard Nick and became anxious again. No, I'm not insane, Wintour said calmly but forcefully. I am doing the best thing for the company. It is my job to make this company flourish and profitable. In fact, dealing with these things isn't even directly my job. It's yours. The fact that I am willing to send Pator to deal with the issue is a favor to you. It's me being lenient because you don't know how Zephix manufacturers and the world of business work. Nick gritted his teeth. You're willing to just fucking kill a kid? Now, he's a kid? Wintour asked with annoyance. Earlier, you hired him like he was a proper adult. You treated him like an adult, so he has to take responsibility for his actions like an adult. He fulfills his contract or bears the consequences, Wintour said. He's fucking 11, Wintour. Nick almost shouted. You are willing to kill an 11-year-old kid for your business. Our business, Nick? Wintour said. Also, you are not much better. You are willing to make a kid work with a specter, the natural enemy of humanity and the most dangerous existence in the world. I warned you, Wintour shouted slightly. I told you that this is your responsibility, but as soon as anything goes wrong, you don't have the maturity to deal with it. I'm the one that has to deal with this issue now. Because you were unable to do your job properly, I now have to give the order to kill a kid. Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I'm some kind of cold machine that can't feel anything? I don't want to fucking kill the kid as well, but I fucking have to. If I don't, everything I have sacrificed for this business will be for nothing. Even more, how do you think Pator will feel? Pator has been trained to deal with these things, but he has never killed a mere kid before. This will also mess him up for a long time. Because you can't deal with your own mistakes. 2 other people have to suffer. Your stupidity Indecisiveness and mental weakness are why Pator and I have to go through shit now. Even more, if you had simply decided against hiring him after I warned you, he also wouldn't need to die, Wintour shouted. Then why didn't you stop me? Nick shouted back. Because it's your responsibility, Wintour said with an aggressive tone. You are my chief Zephix extractor. You are a leader. You are a manager. This is the difference between a Zephix extractor and a chief Zephix extractor. Responsibility. If an extractor dies, it's your fault. Your processes were not good enough, or you chose the wrong person, or you have forced someone to work at the wrong time. If something happens to an extractor or a specter, you are always at least partially responsible. You make the decisions. You have all the freedom. But if something goes wrong, it's on you. Nick gritted his teeth. He acknowledged that what Wintour said made sense, and that he was right. But Horua was just a child. No matter how responsible Nick felt, it simply felt wrong to kill a child. Nick clenched his fists with all of his power, the pain making it a bit easier to think. Deal with the issue, Wintour commanded as he sat down again. If you need Pator to take action, tell me. I gave you this position because I felt like I could trust you, and because I felt like you have the talent and mentality for it. Don't betray my trust in you, Wintour said. Nick didn't answer, and just gnashed his teeth as he gazed fixedly at the desk. At this moment, Nick was overwhelmed by a tsunami of rage, frustration, guilt, fear, uncertainty, and helplessness. I was the one that hired him, Nick thought with pain. I was the one that made the decision. However, Nick thought as he looked at Wintour again. Wintour, Nick slowly said. Wintour didn't answer. Yes, it is my responsibility, Nick said. However, why didn't you tell me what would happen if Horua decided to resign? I know you didn't need to, but I feel like this could have been avoided if you had just told me. Wintour didn't answer for several seconds. I needed you to learn, Wintour said. I had to show you what kind of power you have, and I needed to show you what would happen if you used it irresponsibly. Right now, the company is still new, and our survival is not yet intrinsically connected to the success. If anything goes wrong now, I can still rectify it. After that, Wintour turned silent. Nick took a deep breath. In the end, it's my fault, Nick thought. I should have known that Horua wasn't able to make such a big choice. I should have never told him that he would become a Zephix extractor. Nick took another deep breath as he turned to look at the distant Horua. The next moment, Nick gritted his teeth and narrowed his eyes. And it is my responsibility to deal with the issue. I'm so sorry, Horua. Nick walked over to Horua. When Horua saw Nick's expression, he became terrified and froze. Nick grabbed Horua's arm and pulled him towards the containment unit. Horua's face immediately turned white, and his body began to shake. No. No, Nick. What are you doing? Nick gritted his teeth more. I'm sorry, Horua, but you have to work with the dreamer, Nick said with a dark tone. No, Nick, I don't want to. Please. Horua screamed as he tried his best to free himself from Nick's grip. I'm sorry, Nick repeated. I also don't want to do this. But I'm only doing this for your own good. You can hate me if you want. But right now, I need you to work with the dreamer. No, please, no. Horua shouted as he started to bite Nick's hand. Nick began to bleed, but he just kept pulling Horua. Nick opened the door to the dreamer, and when it opened fully, Nick pushed Horua in before walking in himself. The next second, the door closed behind him. Chapter 47. Bad Guy. No, Nick. I'm sorry, please let me go. Horua shouted in panic as he tried to get past Nick. Nick just shoved Horua forward, making him fall on his ass. This is for your own good, Horua, Nick said with a serious tone. You have to work with the dreamer. You have to. Horua could feel the dead eyes of the dreamer on his back, causing his mind to spiral further into panic. I can't. No. Horua shouted as he tried to leave again. Nick gritted his teeth and pushed Horua away again. I don't want to do this either. But you have to, Nick said. Why? Why do I have to? Horua asked in a mix of betrayal, rage, and terror. What did I ever do to you? I thought we were friends. Nick didn't immediately answer. I can't tell Horua that Wintor would have killed him if he left. If he knows he will become enraged and do something stupid, he might try to cause Wintor as much damage as possible, which would be spreading all secrets that Horua knows. I can't let him do that. Not because it will hurt Wintor, but because it will mean that Horua will die. Horua is a kid, and it's my fault that I didn't see that sooner. If he gets too angry, all of this suffering will be for nothing, and he will die anyway. I can't allow Horua to die, and for that I have to be the bad guy. It's my responsibility anyway. It's only right that I also pay the price. This is for your future, Horua, Nick shouted. You do not know how lucky you have been in the dregs until now. If you don't take the plunge now, you will forever remain in the dregs. You're lying, Horua shouted back. You were willing to let me go, but then you talked to that other guy. And now, you're suddenly forcing me to do this. It's him, isn't it? He's the one that forces you to force me. Nick grew more anxious and gritted his teeth even more. Bang! Horua felt like the world was turning. The next moment, he felt himself hitting the ground. Horua's world spun, and it took a while for him to think clearly again. That's when he saw it. Blood. Teeth. Nick had backhanded Horua, breaking 3 of his teeth in the process. Luckily, the 3 teeth were still baby teeth, which meant that the real teeth were still there. Yet, Horua still felt an incredible amount of pain at this moment. But stronger than the pain was the shock. Nick had hit him. Nick had never hit him before. Even more, this wasn't just an innocent slap. No, this was a strong backhand that caused Horua to bleed. You will thank me later, Nick coldly said. Yet, contrary to how Nick appeared on the outside, he actually felt absolutely disgusted with what he was saying and portraying. Thank me later, as if, Nick thought with gritted teeth. If I were him, I would hate me for the rest of my life. I'm not his family, and I've only been his friend for a couple of months. I have no right to force him to do any of this. Nick took a deep breath, but he made it seem like he was breathing in deeply out of frustration and anger. I'm so sorry, Horua. Nick slowly walked forward. Bang! And Nick kicked Horua towards the middle of the containment unit. I'm sorry. Horua rolled into the middle of the containment unit as he looked with pure shock at Nick. It was like Nick had transformed into someone he had never seen before. Is this who he really is? Horua thought in fear, shock, and betrayal. Was everything else just an act? Did he just want me to sign the contract so that he can force me to do things? Is this who you really are? Yet Horua didn't say anything. Silence. Go work with the dreamer, Nick said coldly. I will stay here until you're done. At that moment, Horua remembered that he was in the containment unit of the dreamer and slowly turned around. Just 2 meters behind Horua was the dreamer. It hadn't moved until now, and it was still looking at Horua with its dead eyes. Horua's mind froze. His heart rate shot past 200 beats per minute, and his world began to swim. Horua started to breathe very rapidly, which only increased his dizziness. And then, he fell over. Horua had lost consciousness due to his overwhelming shock and fear. When the dreamer saw that, it slowly turned to look at Nick. He will be working with us from now on, Nick said slowly. You are allowed to feed off him for the next 8 hours, and if he survives, he will continue to work with you. If he doesn't, I will be the only one working with you from now on. If everything goes well, I will also search for a 3rd person to work with you. Don't do anything stupid, Nick said coldly. The dreamer slowly turned to look at Horua again. Then, it slowly walked towards Horua's head, and it stopped. The dreamer simply stood beside Horua's head and looked fixedly at his closed eyes. A moment later, Horua's eyelids twitched, but at that moment, Nick noticed that the prefix in the containment unit increased. Nick only hoped that this increase didn't mean that the dreamer wanted to attack. Luckily, the increase of the prefix didn't sound the alarm, and Horua's eyelids calmed down 2 seconds later. Horua's breathing changed, and his body involuntarily moved into a more comfortable position. He was asleep. When Nick saw that, he sighed and sat down in front of the door. For a while, Nick just took some shaky breaths, and he slowly put his head in his hands. The dreamer started to feed. The Zephix container was being filled. Yet, Nick wasn't happy. Not even one bit. Chapter 48, Contemplation. In the containment unit, Nick simply sat on the ground, unmoving. He didn't say anything. "I'm so sorry, Horua." Nick didn't move. "I'm sorry. I should have known that things wouldn't be so easy. Even though the dreamer is not very scary for a specter, it is still a specter. And you're a kid. How could I ever think that a child would be able to work with a specter? I'm stupid. I'm fucking retarded. I'm so sorry. I was the one that fucked up, and now you have to pay the price. This is all my fault, Horua." Nick's limbs shook in frustration, guilt, and rage. "I feel so horrible. Please, Horua, when you wake up, don't do anything stupid. You can hate me. You can ignore me. You can try to ruin me. I'm fine with everything. But please, don't try to ruin the business or Wintour. Because if you do that, you will die." As Nick continued to think about everything, his own reality also finally set in. "Actually, I think I'm in a similar position to Horua. Wintour made me his chief Zephix extractor. If I were to betray him, I would also be killed off." Nick's fists clenched. "Wintour is a cold and calculating businessman. He eliminates everyone that goes against him. If I were to tell anyone anything confidential, I would be dead within the day." Slowly, rage and fear also joined Nick's emotions. "Wintour, I know that this is my responsibility, but you knew that this would happen. You might have even wanted this to happen. After all, you said that you wanted me to learn." Nick gritted his teeth in anger. But then, a scene appeared in Nick's mind. The scene depicted Wintour standing behind Nick as he blinded the dreamer. In that scene, Wintour was completely drenched in sewer water. Nick remembered how difficult it had been for Wintour to jump in, and he also remembered how much Wintour had suffered after he had left the sewer again. He only did that because he wanted to catch the dreamer. Nick thought with hatred. Yet, the more time passed, the more Nick felt like he didn't truly believe that. Did Wintour truly only do this because of the dreamer? Actually, probably not. It wasn't certain that I would die. There was a good chance that I would manage to swim towards the entrance of the sewers where Wintour was standing. Then Wintour would have been able to help me without jumping into the sewers. There had been a good 30 meters between the place where Nick had been and the entrance of the sewers. For Wintour to swim that far, he must have jumped into the sewers nearly half a minute before he had arrived at Nick's side. Nick put his hands on his knees and violently grabbed them in frustration. He's not cold, Nick thought. He might appear cold now, but people only show their true faces when they are in a stressful or dangerous situation. When it was important, Wintour was willing to jump into the sewers to save me. It might have also been in his own best interest, but it still must have been very difficult. Right now, he's only cold because he needs to be. This is his job. Like he said, deciding to kill Horua probably also heavily weighs on his mind. And yet, he still talked normally with me, and he didn't say anything out of line. I fucked up, and Wintour has to suffer because of it. But he only reprimanded me. Horua suffers because of me. Wintour suffers because of me. If things go badly, even Peitor will suffer because of me. I was the one that made the decision to get Horua. Wintour warned me, but I didn't listen. This is all because of me. At this moment, most of Nick's emotions vanished, replaced by only two emotions: guilt and determination. This is my fault, and it is my job to rectify these issues, no matter what I have to do or what it will cost. Nick looked forward again. The dreamer was still standing beside the sleeping Horua. At this moment, Horua looked like he was peacefully sleeping. "It's not that bad, Horua. You will just have some bad dreams and wake up. It won't be as bad as you imagined it to be. And when you wake up, you will officially be a Zephix extractor. You will have an actual future, and you will gain powerful abilities. I know things will only improve for you. Sadly, I won't be part of that future. I know you hate me." Nick took a shaky breath. "And I'm fine with it. That's the price I must pay. I don't deserve forgiveness for what I've done." Nick just continued looking at Horua. The memories of what Nick had done to Horua became hazier and hazier. It was almost like all of this hadn't happened. It was like nothing had changed. Yet, whenever Nick looked at Horua and the dreamer, he was reminded of reality. It had happened, but it didn't feel like it had happened. After a while, Nick put his head in his hands again. Silence. Nick didn't move. Time passed. Nick had plenty of time and opportunity to think about what he had done. In this containment unit, there was nothing for Nick to do, and he had to remain here for 8 hours. Paradoxically, it felt like the longest and the shortest 8 hours of Nick's life. On one hand, Nick felt like time was dragging on forever, but on the other hand, Nick despaired at the rapid passage of time. He didn't want to see how Horua would react when he woke up. It was torture. However, it wouldn't be 8 hours until things changed. After just 5 hours, something happened. Crack, crack. Nick heard something and looked over. He saw the dreamer take a couple of steps back as it retreated back into its corner. For just a moment, Nick was confused, but the next moment, Horua's body suddenly started to shake violently. Nick's eyes widened. He's having a seizure. Chapter 49. Worry. When Nick saw the seizure, he realized why the dreamer had retreated. The dreamer was showing that it wasn't trying to kill Horua. It was just that Horua wasn't strong enough to resist whatever the dreamer was showing him. When he had still been here, Albert had told Nick about some potential dangers. Albert had said that working with the dreamer could be dangerous, but it shouldn't be. Since the dreamer was only feeding on mentality, actual injuries were not a thing, and since everyone would forget the dreams they had, mental problems also shouldn't be a thing. The only dangerous part was during the dreams. If someone was pushed too far in a dream, their mind might actually shut down. At that point, their bodily functions might stop working. But Albert said that it would be difficult to notice someone dying like that, Nick thought. He said that they would die quietly. Yet, Horua is definitely not dying quietly. That means I still have a chance to save him. Nick shot to his feet and jumped to Horua's side. The dreamer just looked at Nick from its corner with its dead eyes. Horua started to froth at the mouth, and his body was making sounds as it slapped against the ground. Horua, Nick shouted as he lightly slapped his cheeks. Nick had seen seizures in the dregs, but he had no idea how to deal with them. What was he supposed to do? Was he supposed to keep him steady so that he didn't injure himself? Was he supposed to slap him awake? Horua, hold on! Nick shouted in fear. You're still alive. Horua, you're awake. It was all a dream, Horua. Please. But Horua just continued seizing. The next moment, a disgusting greenish-brown liquid appeared in Horua's throat. Puke, Nick thought. Nick watched as the puke bubbled in Horua's throat. At the same time, Nick heard the sound of Horua desperately trying to breathe. He's asphyxiating on his puke. Nick immediately grabbed Horua and lifted him up by his legs. Then, Nick began to shake Horua to get all the puke to come out. The puke was leaving Horua's mouth and nose. Please, Horua, wake up. Nick was in a panic as he put Horua down again. The shaking had gotten weaker. Nick just hoped that this was a sign of recovery, not death. After some seconds, Horua's half-closed eyes just quietly looked at the ceiling of the containment unit. They didn't move. Nick looked with terror at Horua. Please be alive. Please be alive. Please be alive. Nick repeated in his mind. Horua? Horua, are you okay? Nick asked with a worried voice as he lightly tapped Horua's cheek. Please don't die. Please. Nick just looked at Horua. Horua didn't do anything for several seconds. Slowly, Nick moved forward and put his head on Horua's chest. His heart is still beating, Nick thought with relief. The next moment, Nick held his hand in front of Horua's mouth. He's also breathing. Nick released a sigh of relief. He's still alive. At this moment, Nick's taut emotions finally relaxed, but he still felt a bit nervous about Horua's state. Nick gently lifted Horua and left the containment unit. The dreamer was just watching Nick silently. When Nick went out of the containment unit, he saw Wintour looking up from his desk and walking over. When Wintour saw the limp Horua, he knew that something must have gone wrong. What happened? Wintour asked. Nick took a deep breath and related everything that had happened to Wintour. Wintour's expression became darker the more he heard. It sounds like he has suffered severe mental damage, Wintour said. What will happen to him? Nick asked. We don't know, Wintour said. You don't know? Nick asked with an anxious voice. Everyone reacts differently to severe mental stress, Wintour added. My teacher only went over a couple of outcomes back then. However, one thing is certain. He needs to see a doctor, Wintour explained. Then, let's go to one, Nick said urgently. Wintour put his hand on Nick's shoulder, stopping him from leaving. Nick, calm down. Wintour, I need… Calm down, Wintour shouted. Nick took a deep breath. Yes, what? He asked. Nick, we are not going out to get a doctor. The doctors come to us. First, Nick wanted to shout in aggression, but then his eyes widened. They come to us? He asked. Wintour nodded. Pator, Wintour shouted. Coming, Pator shouted from a distant spot where he was cleaning the floor. Yes, sir, Pator asked. Get a physician from the closest clinic to come here, Wintour ordered. This boy has received heavy mental damage from a specter. When Pator heard that, he took in a deep breath. He looked at Horua in shock, and then looked at Wintour. Pator was amazing at keeping a poker face, but Wintour had still noticed that Pator's expression had become colder as he looked at Wintour. Of course, sir, Pator said before dashing out of the warehouse. Wintour turned to Nick. Put him to the side, he said, as he pointed to one of the walls. Nick nodded. Thank you, Wintour, he said quietly as he walked to one of the walls with Horua. Wintour just sighed. What's there to thank for? Nick didn't put Horua down, but simply sat down with him still in his arms. Several minutes passed before Pator returned with someone. It was a relatively young woman with green hair who was wearing a white coat. Pator led the woman to Nick. When Nick saw her, his breathing quickened. He hoped Horua was okay. Please help him, Nick said in fear. The doctor looked at Horua, and her eyes became visibly cold and distant. Such a young boy, she was disgusted by this company. After all, how could a child enter a containment unit on their own? Yet the expression of the man in front of her spoke of genuine worry and fear. This told the doctor basically what had happened. Stupidity had happened. Put him down, she commanded coldly. Chapter 50 Diagnosis. Nick quickly put Horua down and stepped back. Right now, Nick only hoped that Horua would survive. The doctor took out a small bag with different medical equipment and slowly took out some kind of tool that she put on Horua's chest. Half a minute later, she put the tool away again and put some other tool around Horua's arm for a while. After that, she used a light to look into Horua's vacant eyes. The more time passed, the stronger her frown became. What's his name? She asked. Horua, Nick answered. Horua, can you hear me? She asked in a friendly manner as she looked into Horua's eyes. Horua didn't answer. A moment later, she shined her light into Horua's eyes again. I know you're awake, Horua, she said. Your pupils are constricting when I shine my light into them. That only happens when you are conscious. Horua didn't do anything. For several minutes, the doctor kept talking to Horua as she touched different parts of his body. Yet Horua never showed any reaction. A bit later, the doctor actually slowly lifted Horua's arm and let go. Nick's eyes widened when he saw that the arm didn't fall. The arm actually remained in the air. Horua? Nick asked with hope. However, the doctor just furrowed her brows. The next moment, she snapped her fingers a couple of times in front of Horua's face, and she even acted like she was about to snip Horua's eyes. No reaction. Eventually, she only sighed and slowly lifted Horua into a sitting position and leaned him against the wall. I need to talk to the two of you, the doctor said as she stood up. Nick knew that she was referring to Wintour and him. Of course, Nick said. Nick walked over to Wintour, and the doctor followed him. Wintour looked at the doctor with a neutral expression. What's the diagnosis? First, I need to know what happened, the doctor answered. I know that Zephyr's manufacturers are very secretive, which is why I only need a rough explanation. Wintour nodded. Of course. Wait, Nick said, interrupting Wintour. The two of them looked at Nick. I will tell her, Nick said with a deep breath. After all of this is my fault. Wintour looked at Nick for a bit but nodded. Then, Nick told the doctor about his idea to make Horua a Zephyr's extractor, so that he would have a future outside of the dregs. The doctor was disgusted by Nick, but she kept a professional demeanor. At least he feels guilty, she thought with a snort. When it came to the dreamer, Nick only said that Horua had a nightmare. A nightmare? The doctor asked. A nightmare or the nightmare? A nightmare, Nick answered. You know, a bad dream. The doctor frowned and became quiet. That explains some things, she said. With all of this information, I can be more certain in my diagnosis. Nick and even Wintour listened intently. The boy Horua is awake currently, the doctor explained. His reflexes and autonomous bodily functions are working fine. This means he won't just die suddenly or stop breathing. When Nick heard that, he released a sigh of relief. At least Horua wouldn't die. But, Wintour asked. But, the doctor continued, his mind has become isolated. His actual consciousness does not interact with the outside world anymore. That means his mind doesn't get new information and also can't share information with others. You could say he is conscious but sleeping in a way. Although this is a strong simplification of what is actually happening. Nick looked with worry at the doctor as Wintour frowned. What does that mean? He asked. It means he will continue being in this state for an indeterminate amount of time, the doctor said. He won't move on his own. This means he can't eat, drink, or go to the toilet on his own. The only thing he can do is sleep. Nick took a deep breath. Can we do anything about this? He asked. It's difficult, the doctor said. Since we can't really interact with his consciousness, we can't solve the issue. This is a mental problem, and if we want to save him, we need to somehow wake his mind up. The doctor sighed. Sadly, that's very difficult. After all, information can only enter a mind when the owner of the mind actively absorbs it. We can't just force his mind to listen. Nick felt his chest tighten. Is there anything I can do to save him? Maybe one of the recovery baths? No, the doctor said. Things like recovery baths work on injuries, and Horua technically isn't injured. In a certain way, nothing is wrong with his body. The only thing you can do is to keep him alive, talk to him, and hope that he wakes up on his own. He might wake up tomorrow. He might wake up in a week. He might wake up in a year. Maybe in 10 years. Maybe never. Nick looked at the ground with a horrified expression. This was difficult to come to terms with. Horua had turned into this, and it was Nick's fault. What if he comes into contact with the specter again? Wintour asked. The doctor's expression became strict and chilly. If it's a specter that feeds on mentality, it can probably change things in Horua's mind, but specters that help people are not very common. But could it help? Wintour asked. The doctor didn't answer for a couple of seconds. Yes, but the chances are higher that his mental state will worsen or that he will die, the doctor said coldly. Wintour nodded. Thank you. You can send the bill to us later. The doctor tried her best not to snort. Doctor, how can I keep Horua alive? Nick asked. The doctor glanced at Nick with a neutral expression. 3 meals a day that are easy to digest and swallow. 2 liters of water a day. Regular change of clothes. His bodily waste needs to be cleaned regularly. Once every 2 days you have to wash him. Thrice a day you have to massage his legs and arms, or he will die of a thrombus. A thrombus? Nick asked in confusion. Even Wintour didn't know what that was. If you don't move your extremities for a long time, your blood vessels get constricted and a clot can form in one of them. When the extremity gets moved, the clot travels through the vessels and can get stuck in your heart, lungs, or anywhere else. That part will essentially not get any air and die off, killing you with it. If you want to keep him alive, you need to do all of that.